She wasn't supposed to come back. For 5 years, Evelyn Carter had been erased. From the family records, from the dinner conversations, from every photograph on the Blackwood estate walls. They buried her like a secret too ugly to survive the light. And for 5 years, she let them believe it worked. But today, standing at the iron gates of the most expensive wedding Connecticut had ever seen, with 3 5-year-old children gripping her hands, children with dark Blackwood eyes and strong Blackwood jawlines, Evelyn Carter wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't here for revenge. She was simply here for the truth. If this story already has your heart pounding, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped between a water bill and a grocery store circular like it was nothing, like it was ordinary mail. Evelyn almost missed it. She had been awake since 4:30, the way she was always awake since 4:30, because Mason had crawled into her bed complaining about a nightmare he couldn't describe, and Oliver had followed 10 minutes later just because he didn't want to feel left out. Lily, the only one of her triplets who actually slept through the night with any consistency, had somehow ended up diagonal across the pull-out couch, one sock on, one sock somewhere in the apartment that Evelyn would spend 20 minutes finding after drop-off. By the time Evelyn made it to the mailbox, she had already made 3 breakfasts, located 2 missing sneakers, mediated an argument about who got the blue cup. The answer was always Lily, because the boys had learned the hard way that Lily's quiet did not mean Lily was soft, and signed a permission slip for a school field trip she absolutely could not afford but was going to figure out somehow. She flipped through the envelopes on autopilot. Then her hand stopped. The envelope was cream-colored, heavyweight paper, the kind that costs more per sheet than Evelyn spent on lunch. Her name was written across the front in ink that was too dark, too deliberate, too careful to be anything but a message in itself. No return address, but she didn't need one. She had spent 4 years of her life trying to belong to that handwriting. Margaret Blackwood. Evelyn stood at the mailbox for a long moment. The Chicago wind came off the lake the way it always did in late April, cutting through her jacket like it had somewhere to be and didn't care what it moved through to get there. She could hear the kids through the window above her, the particular chaos of 3 5-year-olds who had been told to put on their backpacks 11 minutes ago and had used those 11 minutes to do everything except that. She opened the envelope. The invitation was beautiful. Of course it was. Margaret didn't know how to produce anything that wasn't beautiful on the surface. The calligraphy was perfect. The gold embossing was perfect. The little illustration of the Blackwood estate in the upper corner was perfect. It requested the honor of Evelyn Carter's presence at the wedding of Adrien James Blackwood and Charlotte Elizabeth Harrington, to be held at the Blackwood family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, on the 14th of June, 6 weeks away. Evelyn read it twice. Then she folded it carefully, put it back in the envelope, and went upstairs to get her children to school. She didn't say anything about it for 3 days. That wasn't because she was afraid. That part of her life, the part where Margaret Blackwood could make her hands shake just by existing, that part was over. Evelyn had done enough therapy, enough early mornings, enough years of being the only parent in the room at every single school event to understand that the fear had been real once, and it had served its purpose, and she didn't live there anymore. She was quiet about it because she was thinking. She worked the dinner shift at Kimura's 4 nights a week, a Japanese-American fusion place in Logan Square, where the tips were decent, and the owner, a 62-year-old woman named Rosa, who was exactly 1/4 Japanese and didn't care if you pointed that out, had a policy about family emergencies that was essentially, handle your life, I'll cover the table. Rosa had covered more than a few tables over the years. She knew about the kids. She knew roughly what Evelyn had come out of, the way people know things when they work close enough together long enough. Not the specific details, but the shape of the damage. On Thursday night, during the 40-minute break between the dinner rush and the late crowd, Evelyn sat in the employee booth in the back and put the invitation on the table between her empty coffee cup and Rosa's reading glasses. Rosa picked it up, looked at it, set it down. "She sent you an invitation to his wedding," Rosa said. "Yes. His wedding. The man who is the father of your 3 children who he has never met because his mother told him the children didn't exist." "That's the one." Rosa was quiet for a second. She wants you to watch. That's what I think too. She wants you to sit in the back somewhere while he marries somebody else and feel like nothing. Evelyn wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, even though it was empty. Probably. So you're not going? Evelyn looked at her. I didn't say that. Rosa made a sound that wasn't quite a word. I've been thinking about it, Evelyn said. I've been thinking that the kids are 5 now. Mason started asking about his father last month. Not every day, but it's coming. Oliver already told his teacher he didn't have a dad, and I had to go in for a meeting about it like I'd done something wrong. She stopped, pressed her lips together. Lily hasn't asked yet, but Lily watches things. She's been watching me read that letter every time I think nobody's looking, and she hasn't said a word, and that somehow feels worse. Rosa tapped one finger on the table. What exactly are you planning to do? Go to the wedding. And bring the children. Evelyn didn't answer right away. That was answer enough. Evelyn? They deserve to be seen, Evelyn said. It came out quieter than she intended, and she hated that because it exposed something she'd been working very hard to keep below the surface. That's all. I'm not going to cause a scene. I'm not going to stand up in the middle of the vows and make a speech. I'm just going to bring my kids to a family event that they were technically invited to, because I was invited, and they are mine, and they have his face. And if people see that and draw their own conclusions, I'm not responsible for other people's conclusions. Rosa stared at her for a long time. Then she said, You know this is going to blow everything up. Maybe. It's going to blow up his wedding, his family. That whole merger deal I read about in the Tribune. I'm aware. And you're fine with that. Evelyn thought about Mason asking where his dad was. She thought about Oliver telling his teacher he didn't have one. She thought about Lily watching her face when she thought nobody was looking. I'm not trying to blow anything up, she said. I'm just done hiding them. Rosa picked up her reading glasses, put them on, looked at the invitation one more time, and then looked at Evelyn over the tops of the frames. Okay, she said. I'll cover your shifts. The next 3 weeks were ordinary in the way that Evelyn's life required ordinariness to function. There was a stomach bug that moved through all 3 kids in sequence, each one getting sick exactly 48 hours after the previous one, which meant Evelyn spent a week and a half doing laundry at midnight and sleeping in 2-hour stretches. There was a parent-teacher conference for Mason, who was apparently biting. Not other kids. Just the edge of his own jacket sleeve, which the teacher found concerning, and which Evelyn found concerning in a different way because she recognized it as the thing she herself did when she was trying not to cry and didn't want anyone to see. There was a plumbing situation in the second bathroom that cost her $400 she moved out of an emergency fund she'd been building for 8 months and then spent 2 weeks being quietly furious about. She didn't tell anyone else about the invitation, not her sister in Phoenix, who would have talked her out of it in the first 30 seconds. Not the kid's pediatrician, Dr. Osei, who had become something like a trusted friend over 5 years of well-child visits, and who had a way of asking, "How are you doing?" Not the kids, you. That always made Evelyn tell the truth. She didn't tell the kids. She bought 3 outfits at a consignment shop on Milwaukee Avenue. Good ones. Not flashy, not formal, but careful. The kind of careful that says, I know exactly what I'm walking into, and I dressed accordingly. Navy dress with a white collar for Lily. Matching khakis and white button-down shirts for Oliver and Mason, which she knew were going to survive exactly until they got out of the car. She bought herself a dark green dress she'd been eyeing for 6 months that made her look like someone who hadn't been broken and reassembled out of stubbornness and overnight shifts. She looked at herself in the full-length mirror behind the bathroom door for a long time after she tried it on. She looked like someone Adrien Blackwood had once loved very much. That was fine. She was that person. She had always been that person. She just also had to become several other people simultaneously in order to survive the aftermath of being that person. And the dark green dress was a reminder that those 2 things could coexist. She did not allow herself to think too much about Adrien. That was a managed situation. She had decided, after a period of time that had been genuinely terrible, and that she had no interest in revisiting, that Adrien was a person she had loved, and that he was also a person who had chosen not to fight for her when fighting would have required going against his mother, and that both of those things were true at the same time, and that she was going to focus on what was in front of her, which was 3 children, which was rent, which was the future. She allowed herself exactly one moment in the 5 years between the divorce and the invitation to sit with what it had felt like to lose him. And that moment had been at 3 in the morning in the hospital, right after the three of them were born, when the room had gotten quiet and she'd been alone with three tiny people who had his exact hairline. And she had cried in a way she had not cried before or since. And then she had stopped, and she had not gone back there. The night before they were supposed to drive to Connecticut, Evelyn sat on the edge of Lily's bed after she thought the kids were asleep. Lily's eyes were open. "Are we going somewhere?" Lily asked. Evelyn looked at her. This child had her mother's dark eyes but her father's uncanny stillness, that quality of paying attention so completely that it felt like pressure, like being held under a very gentle but very firm hand. She was the quietest of the three. She was also the one Evelyn was most careful with, for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. "We're going on a trip tomorrow," Evelyn said. "Where?" "Connecticut." "Is that far?" "Far enough. We're going to be in the car for a while." Lily was quiet for a moment, then, "Is it because of the letter?" Evelyn didn't react. She had learned with Lily that reacting gave the child too much information. "What letter, baby?" "The one you read in the kitchen when you think we're watching cartoons." Lily said it with complete calm, no judgment, no accusation, just the plain delivery of a person stating something observable. "You fold it the same way every time. You put it in the drawer, then later you take it out again." Evelyn looked at her daughter for a long moment. "It's just a trip," she said finally. Lily accepted this without any visible opinion and turned over and went to sleep in roughly 30 seconds, which was its own kind of unsettling. Evelyn sat there for another few minutes, listening to the particular sound of three children breathing in sleep. Oliver's snoring, Mason's occasional murmur, Lily's perfect silence, and thought about what she was actually doing. She was not going to Connecticut to get Adrien back. She was not going to Connecticut to blow up his life. She was going because three children existed in the world who had been officially deemed by the Blackwood family to not exist, and she had decided that the world was going to correct that error, and she was going to do it quietly and calmly and in a dark green dress that fit her exactly right. That was all. That was the whole plan. They left at 5:30 in the morning, Evelyn's 2017 Honda Pilot loaded with a cooler of snacks, a bag of activities that would last approximately 45 minutes, and three children who were unreasonably energetic for an hour that should not have been legal. Oliver fell asleep in the first 30 minutes. Mason kept score of license plates from different states. Lily sat in the far back seat and looked out the window at everything they passed with the concentrated attention of someone cataloging the world for future reference. They crossed into Connecticut just after noon. The landscape changed the way it always changed in that part of the country. Quietly, incrementally, the road getting smoother, the houses getting bigger, the trees getting more deliberate. Like wealth itself had been applied to the geography, like someone had arranged the leaves. Evelyn gripped the steering wheel. She had been here before. She had driven this road before, 4 years before the divorce and 8 years before right now, in the passenger seat of Adrien's car in the summer, when she had been 23 and in love and so entirely certain that love was enough, that the idea of it not being enough hadn't occurred to her as a real possibility. She had met Margaret for the first time on that trip, in the formal sitting room at the front of the estate, and Margaret had shaken her hand with 2 fingers and a smile that said she saw exactly what Evelyn was and had already made her decision. She had been right, Margaret. You had to give her that. The GPS took her to a hotel in Stamford, a clean, budget place she'd booked 3 months ago with points accumulated from years of a credit card she barely used. She got the kids settled, fed them the sandwiches from the cooler, argued with Mason about whether the hotel pool was open, it wasn't, and whether this was an injustice, he believed it was, got Lily out of the shower twice because Lily turned showers into meditative experiences, and finally got all 3 of them into bed by 8:15. She sat at the small desk by the window with the invitation in her hands. Tomorrow morning, 11 o'clock ceremony. She read Adrien's name one more time and Charlotte Harrington's name, and put the invitation down and looked at the ceiling for a while. She didn't sleep well, but she slept. The morning was gray and cool, the kind of Connecticut June morning that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be beautiful. Evelyn got the kids dressed, fought Mason for 8 full minutes over the button-down shirt, which he claimed was strangling him, got Lily's hair into the braid she actually wanted and not the bun she asked for initially, and then changed her mind about, convinced Oliver that yes, he had to wear the dress shoes and no, he could not wear the sneakers, and yes, he could bring the sneakers in the car and change after. She looked at them in the hotel room mirror. 3 small people who looked like her and looked like their father and looked like nobody else on earth. They looked like a fact that hadn't been acknowledged yet. They drove to the estate in near silence. Even Mason, who narrated most of his life aloud, seemed to understand without being told that something was different about this morning. Lily sat in the back seat with her hands folded in her lap. Oliver pressed his nose against the window as the iron gates of the Blackwood estate came into view, flanked by hedges that were 6 feet tall and perfectly squared, with white-coated event staff directing a line of black cars down the long drive. "It's big," Oliver said. "Yeah," Evelyn said. "Do you know these people?" Evelyn pulled in behind a black town car and watched the driver ahead of her get out in a tuxedo. She took one breath through her nose and let it out slowly. "I used to," she said. She parked. She got out. She opened the back doors and got the kids out, and she straightened Mason's collar while he complained about it, and she smoothed Lily's braids, and she looked Oliver dead in the eye and said, "Shoes on, no complaints. I need you with me today." And Oliver, who at 5 years old was already more perceptive than most people gave him credit for, looked back at her and simply said, "Okay, Mom." They walked toward the entrance of the estate. Evelyn kept her back straight and her pace even. She felt the eyes before she saw the people turning to look. The staff member at the entrance checked his guest list and found her name. And in that moment, she watched something flicker across his face. Confusion, recognition, a rapid recalibration, before he stepped aside and let them through. And then they were inside. The Blackwood estate was exactly as she remembered it. Immaculate, enormous, arranged specifically to make a person feel small. The ceremony was being set up in the East Garden, white chairs in perfect rows, flowers Evelyn couldn't name everywhere she looked, and approximately 200 people in formal attire standing in clusters waiting for the 11 o'clock start. The whispers started within 45 seconds of her arrival. She heard her name. She heard the children's ages estimated wrong, then corrected. She heard someone say Adrien's name in a low voice that carried anyway. She didn't look at any of them. She found a place to stand near the outer edge of the seated area, close enough to be clearly present, far enough to have clearly not come to be the center of attention. She took Lily's hand on her left. Oliver slipped his into her right without being asked. Mason stood directly in front of her, hands in his pockets, looking around at all of it with Adrien's exact expression when he was trying to understand something without appearing to be working at it. Evelyn watched Margaret Blackwood appear on the far side of the garden, speaking to a woman in a headset who was clearly the event coordinator. And then Margaret looked up, and her eyes traveled across the garden the way they always had, deliberately, precisely, already knowing where to land. She found Evelyn in about 3 seconds. Evelyn didn't look away. Margaret's face did something complicated. Not surprise. Margaret had sent the invitation. She'd known this was a possibility. She just clearly hadn't believed it would actually happen. What crossed her face instead was something colder and more honest than surprise. It was the look of a woman who had made a very careful move years ago and was now watching the consequences walk toward her in a green dress with 3 children in navy and khaki. Margaret started moving. But the ceremony music had already started, and people were taking their seats. And in the movement and the rearranging and the small 1,000 adjustments of 200 people finding their chairs, Evelyn didn't see where Margaret went. She sat. She settled the kids. Oliver immediately whispered something in Mason's ear that made Mason snort, and she pressed her hand lightly to Mason's knee, and he stopped. Lily sat perfectly still and watched the empty altar at the front of the garden. And then Adrien walked out. He had gotten older in the way men like him got older. The same face, a little more defined, the kind of stillness that had once attracted her to him, now calibrated to a different life. He was in a dark suit, and he was standing at the altar. And for one brief and awful second, his eyes swept across the assembled guests, the way a person does when they're nervous and looking for something familiar, and stopped. They stopped because Oliver had leaned over to ask Lily something, and the two of them had fallen into a minor argument that had Mason turning around to adjudicate, and the small contained chaos of her three children in their matching outfits had apparently been visible from the altar, and Adrien's face had gone completely still in a way that had nothing to do with composure. He was looking at them the way a person looks at something they have been told does not exist. And then he was looking at Evelyn. Evelyn looked back. The music played. The ceremony should have started. The officiant cleared his throat. Somewhere behind Evelyn, a door opened, which meant Charlotte Harrington was about to walk down the aisle, which meant that whatever was about to happen needed to happen now or not at all. Mason tugged her sleeve. "Mom," he whispered, "that man is staring at us." Evelyn kept her eyes on Adrien Blackwood, standing at the altar 30 feet away with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not grief, not guilt, but something beyond both of those, something that looked like a man watching an entire version of his life unspool all at once. "I know," she said quietly. "Why?" Before she could answer, behind her the doors swung open and the processional music swelled, and Charlotte Harrington began her walk down the aisle, and every person in the garden except Adrien turned to watch. Adrien did not turn. Adrien kept his eyes on Evelyn's children. He looked at Mason. He looked at Oliver. He looked at Lily, who had turned to look at him with the precise, unhurried attention of a child who has already decided she is going to make up her own mind about a person. And he took one step forward, one step away from the altar. Charlotte's processional music played on. One step. That was all it took to change the architecture of everything. Adrien Blackwood took one step away from the altar, and the entire garden seemed to inhale at once. 200 people, perfectly dressed, holding their breath in the same instant, the way a crowd does when it understands before its individual members do that something irreversible is happening. The processional music kept playing because nobody had told the string quartet to stop, and Charlotte Harrington was still walking down the white-carpeted aisle in a dress that probably cost more than Evelyn made in 2 years. And none of that mattered because Adrien was not looking at his bride. He was looking at 3 children who had his face. Charlotte stopped first. She stopped about 20 feet from the altar, and her father, silver-haired, substantial, a man who had built a $3 billion shipping empire on the understanding that all situations could be controlled, stopped beside her. The music trailed off one instrument at a time, the violin going last, a single note hanging in the air before it disappeared. Nobody spoke for what felt like a very long time. Then Charlotte said, quietly and with a particular kind of stillness that was worse than shouting, "Adrien." He didn't look at her. "Adrien." Louder this time. Her voice had a fracture in it, not grief exactly, more like the sound of a person watching a very expensive, very carefully constructed thing begin to crack from the inside. He took another step, then another. He was moving down the side of the seating arrangement, not down the aisle, not toward Charlotte, but along the outer edge of the white chairs, toward the place where Evelyn sat with her 3 children in the 3rd row from the back. And Evelyn watched him come and did not move and did not look away, and kept her face arranged in the particular expression she had been practicing for 6 weeks, which was calm, present, unreachable. Margaret appeared from somewhere on the left, moving fast for a woman in heels, intercepting Adrien before he covered half the distance. She got in front of him with one hand on his arm, and Evelyn was too far away to hear what she said, but she could see the quality of it, low, urgent, the clipped efficiency of a woman who had been managing other people's catastrophes for 50 years and considered this one no different. Adrien looked at his mother's hand on his arm. He looked at it the way a person looks at a foreign object. Then he looked back at the children. Mason had turned all the way around in his chair now. He was facing Adrien directly, arms crossed over his chest in the unconscious defensive posture he'd developed sometime around age 3 that Evelyn had always found heartbreaking and admirable in equal measure. Oliver was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, mouth slightly open, the completely unguarded expression of a child who has not yet learned that staring is rude. And Lily had turned just her head, slowly, with the precision of someone who has already assessed the situation and is now simply gathering additional data. Adrien stopped in the aisle about 15 feet from Evelyn. Margaret was still talking. Her hand was still on his arm. Evelyn could hear the shape of the words now, without the content. The rhythm of a woman negotiating, persuading, redirecting. She'd heard that rhythm before. She had sat across a conference table from Margaret Blackwood's lawyer 8 years ago and heard that exact rhythm from a different mouth delivering a different set of instructions that had amounted to the same thing: disappear. Adrien, Margaret's voice sharpened, cutting through the ambient sound of 200 people trying very hard to be quiet. We can handle this after. Do you hear me? After. How old? Adrien said. He wasn't asking Margaret. His eyes were on Evelyn, and his voice was flat and direct and stripped of everything except the question itself. Evelyn held his gaze. She didn't make him ask twice. 5, she said. All 3. She watched his face do the math she'd known he would do the moment he saw them. Counting backward, the dates assembling themselves into a timeline he hadn't known existed, and she watched the exact second it landed. His jaw tightened. A muscle moved in his cheek. He pressed his lips together once and then released them. Is that... He stopped. Started again. Are they... Yes, Evelyn said. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The answer was in Oliver's nose and Mason's jaw and Lily's particular brand of absolute stillness that Evelyn had watched Adrien perform 100 times across 100 different situations that required composure he didn't entirely feel. Margaret grabbed Adrien's arm harder. This is not the place. Get your hand off me, Adrien said. He said it quietly. He said it the way a person says something they mean completely and have no interest in repeating. Margaret released his arm. Somewhere behind them, Gerald Harrington said something in a low voice to his daughter. Charlotte Harrington, who had lowered her bouquet to her side and whose face had gone through approximately 7 distinct expressions in the last 90 seconds, and settled on something that looked remarkably like cold fury, yet said, Gerald, don't, in a voice that made clear she was capable of handling her own catastrophes. Thank you. I want a DNA test, Adrien said. Evelyn had expected this. She'd spent 6 weeks expecting exactly this, had made her decision about it, had rehearsed in the shower how she would respond. But hearing it in front of 200 people and her 3 children still required something from her. A small, precise act of swallowing what she actually felt and replacing it with what she needed to be. That's your right, she said evenly. Today. I want it today. Adrien, Margaret started. Mother. He turned to look at her for 1 second, and whatever Margaret saw in his face was apparently sufficient because she closed her mouth. He turned back to Evelyn. Today. Fine, Evelyn said. There's a lab in Stamford. We can be there in 40 minutes. Mason tugged her sleeve again. He was looking up at her with the particular expression he got when he was trying very hard to understand something, and the pieces weren't arranging themselves the way he needed them to. Mom, he said, low. Who is this man? The garden was completely silent. Every single person in it was waiting for Evelyn's answer. She looked down at her son. She had thought about this moment. She had thought about it at 4:30 in the morning more times than she could count. How she would handle the moment when her children asked the question in front of people who had spent years pretending the answer didn't exist. She had decided she would be honest. Not all the way honest. Not all the detail, but honest in the most important direction. He's someone we came a long way to see, she said quietly. Mason looked at her, then at Adrien, then back at her, with the evaluative gaze of a 5-year-old who is being managed and knows it and has decided to let it go for now. Adrien crouched down. It happened fast enough that Evelyn almost moved to stop it by instinct, the raw, protective instinct that 5 years of single parenthood had made into something close to a reflex. But she held still. She watched Adrien Blackwood get down on one knee on the white-carpeted aisle of his own wedding ceremony and put himself at eye level with her son. Mason didn't back up. That was the thing about Mason. He was the child most likely to bite the sleeve of his jacket when he was trying not to cry, and also the child most likely to stand his ground when a stranger got in his space. He crossed his arms tighter and looked at Adrien directly. "What's your name?" Adrien asked. "Mason." "That's a good name." "I know," Mason said, in the flat tone of a child who has been told this and finds it unremarkable. Something moved across Adrien's face. Not quite a smile. Something more broken than a smile. He looked at Oliver, who gave him an enormous wave with absolutely no hesitation, because Oliver's default setting was open, and Evelyn both loved and worried about this constantly. Then he looked at Lily, who looked back at him with those dark eyes that held everything and gave back nothing. "Hi," Adrien said to Lily. Lily considered him for a moment. "Hi," she said finally, in the careful voice she used when she hadn't made up her mind yet. Adrien stood back up. His face, when he turned back to Evelyn, was not the face of the man who had walked to that altar an hour ago. It was older, hollowed out in some way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from understanding that you have been wrong about something enormous for a very long time. "The lab," he said. "Can we go now?" "What about—" Evelyn glanced toward the altar, toward Charlotte, toward the 200 people who were all very carefully pretending they weren't watching. "The lab," Adrien said again. Charlotte Harrington's voice came from behind him, clear and controlled and sharp as a letter opener. "By all means, Adrien, don't let me stop you." Adrien closed his eyes for half a second. Then he opened them and turned around and walked toward his almost wife, and the conversation that followed was not something Evelyn could hear in full, but she could hear the registers. Charlotte's voice staying controlled and getting colder, Adrien's voice staying low and getting quieter, which in Evelyn's experience with him was always the more alarming direction. Gerald Harrington inserted himself twice. Both times, Adrien answered him briefly and without apparent interest in Gerald Harrington's opinion. Margaret crossed the garden to Evelyn. She moved the way she always moved, like she'd already decided how the room was arranged before she entered it. She stopped 3 feet from Evelyn and looked at her with the expression Evelyn remembered from the very first meeting, the one that said, "I have assessed you completely, and the assessment was not favorable." "You should have called," Margaret said. "I had an invitation." "You know what I mean." "I do," Evelyn said. "I chose not to." Margaret glanced at the children with the particular controlled distaste of a woman who found the existence of a complication more offensive than the complication's content. Then she looked back at Evelyn. "Whatever you think is happening right now, you don't understand the full picture." "I understand my picture pretty well," Evelyn said. "I understood it from a hospital bed 5 years ago when your lawyer showed up instead of your son." Something flickered in Margaret's face. It wasn't guilt. Evelyn didn't think Margaret was built for guilt in the conventional sense, but it was something adjacent to it, the recognition maybe of a move that had cost more than it was worth. "There were complications," Margaret said. "My children were the complication," Evelyn said, "and you resolved it." "I protected this family." "You protected a merger," Evelyn said. "I know the difference. I think you do too." Margaret's jaw set. She was a beautiful woman, had always been a beautiful woman, with the kind of face that belonged in a portrait in a room exactly like this one. She looked at Evelyn for a long moment with an expression that was calculating something Evelyn couldn't fully see. "The Harrington deal is worth $3 billion, Margaret said quietly. "Do you have any idea what you've just done to that deal?" "I came to a family event with my children," Evelyn said. "What happened to the deal is between you and the Harringtons. Don't be naive. You walked in here knowing exactly what would happen." "I walked in here because my kids deserve to exist," Evelyn said, and her voice was steady. It was completely steady, and she was proud of that in a way she'd never be able to explain to anyone who hadn't spent 5 years stitching themselves back together from the inside. "That's the only reason I'm standing here, not the deal, not you, not him. Them." She did not gesture at the children. She didn't need to. "They exist. They're his. And I'm done pretending otherwise for anyone's convenience." Margaret looked at her for another long moment. Then she turned and walked away. The garden had begun to dissolve into something messier than a crowd. Small clusters of people talking with the barely suppressed intensity of people who have just witnessed something significant and cannot wait to share it. The event coordinator was having a visible crisis with her headset. The string quartet had packed their instruments with the practiced efficiency of musicians who have learned to read a room. Gerald Harrington was on his phone, walking fast toward the estate's main building, his voice inaudible but his posture communicating urgency clearly enough. Charlotte caught Evelyn's eye from across the garden. Evelyn expected cold fury. She expected the look of a woman who had just lost a wedding she'd spent presumably 2 years planning. What she got instead was something she hadn't prepared for, a long, assessing look that was almost without effect, the look of a woman who was running her own private calculations and had arrived at a conclusion. Charlotte held the look for 3 seconds, then she turned and walked inside. The lab in Stamford was a clean corporate medical facility that handled paternity testing among other services, and Evelyn had researched it months ago in a conversation with herself she'd spent a long time pretending she wasn't having. The woman at the front desk was professionally neutral in the way people in that industry had to be. She'd clearly seen situations arrive with varying degrees of emotional weather, and she processed all of them with the same quiet efficiency. The swabs took less than 3 minutes per child. Oliver submitted to the process with the cooperative enthusiasm he brought to most things. Mason made it clear verbally and repeatedly that the swab felt weird, that it was too big, that he didn't see why it was necessary, and that he was registering his objection formally even if nobody was writing it down. Lily opened her mouth when asked, held still, and watched the technician's face the entire time with the focused attention of a child constructing a comprehensive understanding of a stranger. Adrien sat across the waiting room from Evelyn while the children colored in the corner with worksheets the front desk woman had produced from somewhere with an efficiency that suggested she kept them specifically for days like this. He didn't look at Evelyn. He looked at the children. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick with everything that had happened and everything that preceded it, layered on top of 5 years of no contact, and underneath that 5 years, the 4 years before it, when they had been the most important person in each other's lives. Evelyn knew that silence. She had lived in it. "When did you find out you were pregnant?" Adrien asked. He was still watching the kids. His voice was careful, the way a person's voice is when they're afraid of what they're about to hear. "Before the divorce was finalized," Evelyn said. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't." I tried to tell you," Evelyn said. Flat, not angry, just the plain delivery of a fact she had carried for 5 years and was no longer interested in softening. "3 times. Your mother's lawyers sent me a letter after the 3rd time." He turned to look at her then. "They said I was fabricating a pregnancy claim to interfere with the divorce settlement," Evelyn said. "They cited my previous attempt to contact you directly as evidence of harassment. They said if I made contact again, they would pursue a restraining order." She let that land. She gave it the silence it deserved. "I had just turned 26. I didn't have a lawyer. I had $200 in my checking account and no family in Chicago who could do anything useful, and I was 11 weeks pregnant with triplets." She looked at him. "So no, I didn't try a 4th time." Adrien's face had gone through something over the course of that speech that Evelyn didn't look at too closely because she didn't need what it might produce in her. She had not come to feel sorry for him. She had not come to feel anything she hadn't already worked through in a therapist's office in Logan Square over the course of 3 years of fortnightly sessions she'd paid for by picking up extra shifts. "My mother told me you miscarried," Adrien said. His voice had gone rough. "She told me you'd contacted her directly, that you were having a breakdown, that you needed—" He stopped. "She said there was no pregnancy." "I know what she told you." "Evelyn, I'm not here to argue about what you were told," she said. "I'm here because those 3 kids are coloring pictures of dogs in the corner of a paternity testing lab on what was supposed to be a Saturday afternoon. And they deserve better than a history that pretends they don't exist." He looked at the children again. Oliver had abandoned the worksheet and was attempting to explain something elaborate to Mason using a crayon as a prop. Mason was skeptical. Lily had finished her worksheet and was now carefully coloring the back of it for reasons she hadn't shared with anyone. "Mason," Adrien said, just the name, like he was testing the sound of it. "He bites his sleeve when he's trying not to cry," Evelyn said, without knowing exactly why she said it. "He gets it from me. Oliver is afraid of moths, specifically, not insects in general, just moths. And he has a very sophisticated theory about why moths are different that he will explain to you at length if you let him. Lily—" She stopped, looked at her youngest. "Lily decides things about people very slowly, and once she decides, it doesn't change easily. So if you're going to be in her life, be in it consistently, because if you're not, she won't ask you why. She'll just close the door, and you won't be able to find it again." Adrien stared at Lily. Lily was coloring the back of her worksheet without looking up, but something in the angle of her head suggested she was listening to every word. I missed 5 years, he said. Yes. I missed everything. Yes. I don't know how to. He pressed his hand over his mouth. Let it drop. I don't know where to start. That's not something I can help you with, Evelyn said. That's something you have to figure out. The technician came back at that point to inform them that the expedited results would be available within the hour, given the priority processing Adrien had apparently arranged in the car ride over with a phone call that had cost him an amount Evelyn preferred not to think about. Adrien thanked her. The technician nodded and went back through the door. The hour passed the way hours pass when everyone in a room is waiting for something, badly, in fits and starts, with too much awareness of the clock. Evelyn's phone vibrated 11 times with messages from Rosa, from her sister in Phoenix, who had apparently seen something on social media, from a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be a journalist, which told her that whatever had happened at the Blackwood estate had already made it onto someone's feed somewhere. She turned her phone face down. Oliver fell asleep on the waiting room chairs with his head on Mason's shoulder. Mason allowed this with the studied indifference of a brother who would never admit he didn't mind. When the technician came back with the results envelope, Adrien stood up. He took it. He looked at it for a moment without opening it. Then he looked at Evelyn. I already know, he said. So do I, she said. He opened it anyway because some things you have to see written down. He read it twice. His expression didn't change the way you'd expect. There was no collapse, no dramatic exhale. What happened instead was much quieter, and in some ways much worse. He simply became still, the way a person becomes still when they've received confirmation of something they already knew but had been, somewhere deep and unexamined, hoping wasn't true. Because if it was true, and it was, then everything else was true too. The 5 years, the letters, the lawyers. His mother's voice telling him calmly that there was no pregnancy, no child, nothing to concern himself with. All of it true. He folded the paper. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, the jacket he'd worn to his own wedding 3 hours ago. He looked across the room at his 3 children, 2 of whom were asleep and 1 of whom was watching him with dark, patient eyes. He took his phone out of his pocket. Evelyn watched him dial. I need you to get me the Harrington file, he said when someone answered. All of it. The trust documents, too. And the audits. Specifically the distributions from 2017 to present. A pause. Because I'm asking you to. Because I pay you to handle what I ask you to handle. Another pause. Shorter. Get me the files. He hung up. Evelyn looked at him. My mother controls the family trust, he said. He wasn't explaining it to Evelyn. He was saying it the way a person says something aloud to hear what it sounds like outside their own head. The trust has provisions for direct heirs. If there are direct heirs and the trustee has knowledge of them, he stopped. She would have had to disclose. Legally, she would have been required to restructure the distributions. Evelyn absorbed this. And she didn't. She told me there were no heirs. He looked at her. She told me that under oath, during the estate review in 2020. The room got very quiet. Evelyn had not known about the 2020 estate review. She had not known about the oath. What she understood in the silence of the waiting room, with her children sleeping against each other and the folded DNA results in Adrien's inside pocket, was that what she had walked into today was larger than a wedding and older than a merger, and that the thing Margaret Blackwood had done was not merely cruel in the personal sense, but had crossed into territory that had a different name entirely. Adrien looked at his phone, then at the pocket where he'd put the results, then at his children. She committed perjury, he said. Evelyn didn't answer. He looked at her, and for the first time in the entire afternoon, his face showed something that wasn't grief or guilt or the flat, controlled shock of a man absorbing too much at once. What she saw instead was the expression she remembered from the early years, from the person he had been before the Blackwood estate, and Margaret's particular gravity had finished reshaping him. A specific quality of anger, quiet and total, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself because it has already decided what it's going to do. I need to make some calls, he said. He stood up and walked to the far end of the waiting room, phone already at his ear. Evelyn sat very still. Oliver shifted in his sleep, resettling against Mason, who pulled absently away and then, in the next second, allowed it again. Lily was still watching Adrien from across the room, and she did not look away even when he turned his back, and she did not look at Evelyn when she spoke. "Mom," Lily said quietly. "Yeah, baby." Lily was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is he going to leave again?" Evelyn looked at her daughter. 5 years old, sitting straight in a waiting room chair with a completed worksheet in her lap and the careful, composed face of someone who had already learned that composure was necessary, had learned it early, the way children do when they absorb the emotional weather of the person they live closest to. Evelyn opened her mouth, and across the room, in a voice that was low but not low enough, she heard Adrien say into his phone, "I want to know everything she moved, every transfer, every distribution that went out after March of 2019. And I want the name of the lawyer who drafted those letters to Evelyn Carter." Evelyn closed her mouth. She looked at her daughter. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. Lily considered this. She looked at Adrien's back. Then she turned back to her worksheet and picked up a crayon and began coloring something on the cover with the deliberate focus of a child who has made a decision about her feelings and decided to process them privately. And Evelyn watched her and felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, she was too careful for hope, but something that had been closed for a long time opening slightly, just slightly, like a window in a room that had been sealed too long, letting in an air that was cold and unfamiliar and necessary. That was the word that came to Evelyn in the car on the way back to the hotel, with 3 exhausted children in the back seat and the Connecticut dusk settling over the highway like a gray wool blanket. Necessary. The air coming through that window was cold and unfamiliar and necessary, and she sat with that word in the front of her mind and did not allow herself to go further than it. She got the kids back to the hotel room. She ordered pizza from a place 2 blocks away that the front desk recommended, and she let Oliver pick the movie even though he always picked something everyone had already seen, and she sat on the edge of the bed and watched her children eat pizza in their dress clothes because she had forgotten to tell them to change. And Lily had a string of cheese on her chin, and Mason was already half asleep with a slice in his hand, and Oliver was laughing at the movie with his whole body the way he always did, and Evelyn looked at all 3 of them and thought, "This is what I protected. Whatever happens next, this is what I protected." She put them to bed at 9:15. She sat at the window with her phone in her hand for a long time after. Adrien had texted once during the drive back. 2 sentences. "My lawyers will contact you Monday. I want to be involved, in whatever way makes sense to you." She had read it 3 times and not responded. That was not because she didn't have something to say. It was because she had too many things to say, and none of them were ready yet. Her sister in Phoenix had called twice. Rosa had sent 6 texts in escalating levels of concern. There were 4 voicemails from numbers she didn't recognize, and when she checked one, it was a producer from a local Connecticut news station, which meant the story had moved faster than she'd thought, and in a direction she hadn't planned for. She turned off her phone. She slept for 4 hours. She woke at 2 in the morning with the feeling she always got when something was wrong before she could identify what it was. A tightening in her sternum, a particular quality of alertness that 5 years of being a single parent had coded into her nervous system as pay attention. She lay still for a moment. The kids were breathing. The room was quiet. There was no emergency. Then she understood what it was. She reached for her phone and turned it back on. 14 new messages. 3 more missed calls. And a news alert from the Hartford Courant, time-stamped 11:47 p.m., that read, "Blackwood Family Trust under scrutiny. Following wedding scandal, sources allege heir concealment." She sat up. She read the article in the dim light of the hotel room, her children asleep behind her, and the further she read, the colder she got. Not because of anything she didn't already know, but because of the speed. This had moved from a garden in Greenwich to a newspaper article in 11 hours. Somebody had talked. Somebody had been at that wedding, or at that lab, or in Adrien's circle of lawyers, and had decided the story was worth more as a news item than as a private negotiation. She did not yet know who. She would find out, and when she did, the answer would be the kind of thing she should have anticipated and hadn't. Because even after everything, even after 5 years of being careful and managed and deliberate, she had still underestimated the Blackwood family's capacity to turn a situation around. Sunday passed in the muffled, suspended way of a day between catastrophes. Evelyn drove the kids back to Chicago. 8 hours in the car, 2 rest stops, one argument about the aux cord that she resolved by turning on the radio and refusing to negotiate. The children sensed, in the way children sense the weather of adults, that something had shifted in the landscape of their lives, but none of them had the vocabulary for it yet, and so they expressed it in small, displaced ways. Oliver was clingier than usual. Mason was louder. Lily was quieter. Evelyn drove. She listened to the road. She did not allow herself to think about Monday. Monday came anyway. At 8:15 in the morning, Evelyn was standing in her kitchen in Logan Square making toast when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize and a Chicago area code. She let it ring through to voicemail. The toast came up. She was spreading butter when her phone rang again, the same number, and she answered it because 2 calls in 30 seconds generally meant something had gone wrong rather than something could be arranged. "Is this Evelyn Carter?" The voice was female, middle-aged, with the clipped efficiency of someone who made a lot of calls and expected people to already know why. "Who is this?" "My name is Diane Kwan. I'm with the firm Harrington Weiss, and I represent Gerald Harrington. Mr. Harrington would like to arrange a conversation at your earliest convenience regarding—" "I don't have a lawyer," Evelyn said. A pause. "I'm aware. That's part of what Mr. Harrington would like to discuss." Evelyn set down the butter knife. "Gerald Harrington wants to pay for my lawyer. Mr. Harrington would like to facilitate a conversation. He believes you and he may have overlapping interests in this situation, and he'd like to—" "What overlapping interests?" Evelyn said flatly. Another pause, shorter this time. "Mr. Harrington's daughter was engaged to Adrien Blackwood based on representations made by the Blackwood family regarding the estate's financial standing and the terms of the family trust. If those representations were false, which the current reporting suggests they may have been, Mr. Harrington has grounds for legal action. But any legal action would be significantly strengthened by the testimony of—" "Stop," Evelyn said. Diane Kwan stopped. Evelyn stood in her kitchen with her cooling toast and her 3 kids in the next room watching morning cartoons and the phone against her ear, and she felt the shape of what was being offered. Gerald Harrington hadn't lost a daughter's heart at that wedding. Charlotte had been clear enough in that garden. The cold, assessing look of a woman running calculations, not crying. What Gerald Harrington had lost was a $3 billion merger, and he had decided that the fastest way to recover his position was to use Evelyn Carter as the opening instrument of a lawsuit against Margaret Blackwood. He didn't want to help her. He wanted to use her. "Tell Mr. Harrington I'll think about it," Evelyn said, and ended the call. She stood there for another 10 seconds. Then she went into the living room and looked at her children. Oliver was upside down on the couch, with his feet in the air, watching cartoons from an angle that should have been uncomfortable. Mason was on the floor, legs crossed, eating dry cereal from a cup because he'd decided 2 weeks ago that dry cereal was better and had not reversed this position. Lily was sitting in the armchair with a book in her lap that she wasn't reading. She was looking at Oliver with the expression she got when she was deciding whether his current activity represented a genuine hazard. They were fine. They were completely fine. Evelyn went back to the kitchen and called Rosa. "I saw the paper," Rosa said before Evelyn could speak. "Which paper?" "The Tribune picked it up this morning. It's on their website. There's a picture of you from outside the lab. Someone with a phone. It's not great quality, but it's clearly you and the kids." Evelyn sat down at the kitchen table. "Okay." "Evelyn." "I'm okay." "You don't sound okay. You sound like a person who's been awake for 36 hours and is using the word okay as structural support." "I've been awake 40 hours, Evelyn said. "Can you cover my shifts this week?" "Already done." "What do you need?" "I need to know if you know any family lawyers." Rosa was quiet for a second. "I know someone. She's good. She's not cheap, but she has a sliding scale and she owes me something from a situation. In 2019, I'll tell you about some other time. I'll get you her number." "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just don't do anything by yourself. Whatever they're offering you, don't sign anything until someone who isn't scared of these people reads it first." Evelyn almost said, "I'm not scared of these people." But that wasn't precisely the right answer. She wasn't scared the way she'd been scared at 26, sitting alone in a hospital with lawyers' letters and no money and 3 babies coming. That fear had been formless and total, the kind that takes up all the air. What she felt now was different, smaller and harder. A specific apprehension about a specific thing, which was that she had walked into a situation that was larger than she'd understood, and that the people in it were now moving around her with agendas she was still mapping. "I won't sign anything," she said. She got the lawyer's number from Rosa. She called it. She left a voicemail with her name and the short version of the situation, which took approximately 90 seconds and sounded, even to her own ears, like something that should not have been possible to make happen. Then she sat and waited. She didn't have to wait long. The callback came at 11:15, and the lawyer, whose name was Patricia Oduya, and who had a voice like someone who had eaten several large corporations for lunch over the course of a distinguished career, listened to the full version of Evelyn's story without interrupting for 14 minutes. When Evelyn finished, Patricia was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "The lawyer who drafted those letters to you in 2019, Patricia said. "Do you still have them?" "I have copies." "Good. Don't touch the originals if you have them. Where are they?" "Storage unit in Pilsen." "Get them today. Don't mail them. Don't photograph them. Bring them to my office in person. I'm going to need you to tell me everything you remember about the sequence of events from the time you first attempted to contact Adrien Blackwood to the day you received the last legal letter. Everything. Dates, if you have them. General sequence, if you don't. Can you come in this afternoon?" "I have 3 5-year-olds. "Bring them," Patricia said without missing a beat. "My waiting area has a television and a very old associate who has nothing to do on Mondays and genuinely enjoys children." Evelyn went to the storage unit in Pilsen. The box was where she'd put it 6 years ago, pushed to the back behind the kids' outgrown infant equipment and the remnants of an apartment she'd had to leave in a hurry when her lease was up and she couldn't cover the renewal and the hospital bills at the same time. She opened the box in the fluorescent light of the storage unit with the smell of old cardboard and dust, and she found the folder she'd labeled with a kind of grim organizational precision she was both proud of and sad about. Blackwood. Legal. 4 letters. 3 from the law firm of Merchant, Cole & Associates, which she had since looked up and established was the firm the Blackwood family used for sensitive matters. 1 from a different firm she hadn't recognized at the time, signed by a partner named David Rourke, which had been the most recent and the most explicit. Any further contact, however made, direct or indirect, would result in immediate legal action, including but not limited to a restraining order, injunctive relief, and referral to the relevant professional authorities should Ms. Carter pursue any form of nursing licensure in the state of Illinois. She had been in her first semester of nursing school when that letter arrived. She had withdrawn the following week. She had not in 5 years allowed herself to do the full accounting of what that one letter had cost her. The career rerouted, the income foregone, the version of herself that had been in reach and then wasn't. She had managed it the only way she knew how to manage unbearable things, which was to set it in the box with the label and put the box in the back and not look at it. She looked at it now. She put the folder in her bag, closed the box, and drove to Patricia Oduya's office in the West Loop. Patricia's office was on the 14th floor of a building that had the particular energy of a place where significant things were decided about people's lives. Patricia herself was a small, precise woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain, and the manner of someone who has long since stopped being surprised by the degree to which people are willing to do damage to other people in order to avoid accountability. She read the 4 letters in silence while Evelyn's children occupied the waiting room with the associate, who was indeed elderly, genuinely patient, and apparently skilled at paper airplanes. Patricia set the last letter down on her desk. "David Rourke," she said. "You know him?" "I know of him," Patricia said carefully. "He does a specific kind of work for a specific kind of client. He's not someone you hire to send a routine legal letter. He's someone you hire when you need the letter to carry a particular weight." She picked it up again, reading a section near the bottom. "The nursing licensure threat is significant. That's a targeted threat. It means whoever drafted this knew you were in nursing school and made a deliberate decision to use that as leverage." "Margaret Blackwood would have known," Evelyn said. "Adrien would have told her when we were together." "Yes, Patricia put the letter down. This isn't just a cease and desist. This is an instrument designed to make you smaller, to take something specific from you and make you understand that they could take more. She looked at Evelyn over her glasses. You withdrew from nursing school the week after, and you've been working in food service since. Restaurant management mostly, waitressing when I needed the income. Patricia was quiet for a moment, in the particular way of a person doing arithmetic that is not about numbers. Okay, here's what I'm looking at. The estate oath issue, if Adrien's legal team pursues it, and it sounds like they will, creates a perjury exposure for Margaret Blackwood that is serious. The trust distribution issue creates a potential fraud exposure. Both of those are Adrien's to pursue. Your children are the mechanism by which those claims exist, but you are not the plaintiff in those actions. She folded her hands. Your exposure is different. Your potential claims are different. Interference with parental rights, harassment via legal threat, economic damage, the nursing school withdrawal, the career impact, pain and suffering. These are civil claims, and they're yours. Evelyn absorbed this. How much would this cost? To litigate fully? More than you have, Patricia said, with the matter-of-fact directness Evelyn had already come to appreciate. Which means we need to think strategically about what you want. Because the Harrington offer, Evelyn looked up. How do you know about the Harrington offer? Patricia's expression shifted slightly. Gerald Harrington's lawyer called me this morning, before you did. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Evelyn set her hands flat on her knees. Gerald Harrington's lawyer called you before I called you. Yes. Rosa gave me your number this morning. Yes. And Gerald Harrington's lawyer called you before that. At 8:40 a.m., Patricia confirmed. She was watching Evelyn with the steady attention of a woman who was allowing a person to arrive at their own conclusion without interference. Evelyn sat with this for a moment. He already knew I'd need a lawyer, she said. He called you, specifically you, before I'd even decided to get one, which means someone told him I would call you, which means... She stopped. The shape of it was assembling itself in a way she didn't like. Rosa. Patricia said nothing. Rosa told the Harringtons I'd be calling you, Evelyn said. The words felt strange in her mouth, wrong and specific at the same time. I can't speak to how Mr. Harrington's team obtained my name, Patricia said carefully. What I can tell you is that I received the call, and I disclosed it to you the moment you arrived in my office. And I want you to understand that my obligation is to you and only to you if you choose to retain me. Evelyn looked at the window. 14 floors up, the Chicago skyline was gray and flat under an overcast sky. She thought about Rosa, who had covered her shifts for 3 years, who had let her cry in the employee booth at midnight without asking questions she didn't want to answer, who had given her Patricia Oduya's number this morning with the instruction to not sign anything until someone who isn't scared of these people reads it first. Rosa, who had apparently been in contact with the Harrington family at some point before this morning. How long has Gerald Harrington been building this case? Evelyn said. Patricia looked at her steadily. My understanding from the call this morning is that his team has been monitoring the Blackwood Trust situation for approximately 18 months. 18 months. The current article had been published within 11 hours of Evelyn arriving at that wedding. Not because a guest had pulled out a phone, because someone had already known the story and needed the wedding to be the trigger. He knew I was coming, Evelyn said. Not a question. Patricia didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. Evelyn thought about the invitation, the cream-colored envelope in her mailbox on a Tuesday morning, her name in Margaret Blackwood's handwriting. She had assumed for 6 weeks that Margaret had sent it as a weapon, a final public humiliation, a chance to watch Evelyn sit in the back of a garden and feel erased. And Margaret had intended exactly that. But Margaret was not the only one who had known about the invitation. Somebody else had known. Somebody had made sure Evelyn received it, or had known she would receive it, or had made a calculation that Evelyn would do exactly what she had done. Because anyone who had spent 5 minutes understanding Evelyn Carter would have understood that the one thing you could do to make her walk into a room she'd been excluded from was tell her her children were being erased in that room. She had walked into a garden in Greenwich, Connecticut, and believed she was making a choice. She had been moved. Who is Rosa connected to? Evelyn said. Her voice was very flat, very quiet. I don't know the specifics of the relationship, Patricia said, but Gerald Harrington has been building a case against the Blackwood family for a significant period of time. Cases like that require information, people close to the subjects, ongoing relationships that generate. She was feeding him information, Evelyn said, about me, about the kids, about what I knew and what I was doing. She pressed one hand flat against the side of her face, held it there. For how long? Patricia was quiet. How long, Evelyn said again, and her voice cracked slightly on the second word, which she hated, which she allowed, which she corrected immediately. I don't know, Patricia said, and Evelyn believed her, which was the only clean thing in the room. But if you want my professional assessment, anyone used as an ongoing source is usually placed near the beginning of an investigation, not recruited in the middle. The beginning. Rosa had hired her 8 months after the divorce, 8 months after the letters, after the nursing school withdrawal, after Evelyn had landed in Logan Square with 3 infant car seats and a sublet and the specific grimness of a person starting completely over. She had walked into Kimura's with a resume that had a gap in it, and Rosa had looked at it for 30 seconds and said, Thursdays and Saturdays to start, you can pick up more when you're ready. And that had been that. 3 years. 3 years of covered shifts and employee booth conversations, and the particular warmth of someone who seemed to understand without being told. Evelyn stood up. She stood up because she needed to be vertical. She needed the physical fact of standing to keep the next several seconds from becoming something she couldn't manage. I need a minute, she said. Patricia nodded and did not follow her out of the office. Evelyn went to the window in the hallway outside and stood with both hands on the sill and looked at Chicago for 90 seconds. She thought about every conversation in that employee booth, every time she'd said something unguarded about the kids, about Adrien, about what had happened and what she knew. Every time Rosa had asked a question that had seemed natural, seemed caring, seemed like the ordinary curiosity of someone who was genuinely invested. She thought about Rosa handing her Patricia Oduya's number this morning, sending her directly to the lawyer Gerald Harrington had already called. She was not going to cry about this in a hallway. She was absolutely not going to do that. She was going to stand here for exactly as long as it took for her sternum to stop feeling like it was being pressed from the inside, and then she was going to go back into that office and make a decision about what came next, because that was what she did. That was the only thing she had ever done that had worked. She decided what came next, and she went there. The hallway was quiet. From the waiting room at the end of the hall, she could hear Oliver laughing at something the elderly associate had done, and Mason saying something skeptical, and then Oliver laughing again. And the specific quality of those sounds, the ordinary, irreplaceable sounds of her children being fine, being themselves, being present, settled something in her chest that had been destabilizing. She went back into the office. Tell me what my options are, she said. She sat down. She put her hands in her lap and looked at Patricia directly. All of them, including the ones that are worse for me. Patricia looked at her for a moment with an expression that was close to respect and was maybe something even harder to earn than that. All right, she said. First option. Her phone rang. Patricia glanced at it, reached to silence it, and then her hand stopped. She looked at the screen and then at Evelyn with an expression that was the first fully unguarded thing Evelyn had seen on her face since walking into this office. It's Adrien Blackwood's attorney, Patricia said. Evelyn stared at her. They're filing an emergency motion, Patricia said, reading from her screen. Against Margaret Blackwood. Today. She looked up. They're also citing you as a necessary party. She read further. Her expression changed again. Shifted into something Evelyn couldn't immediately categorize. Evelyn. She turned the phone so Evelyn could see the message. They found something in the trust audit. Margaret's lawyers apparently anticipated the review and spent yesterday moving assets. They transferred $34 million out of the Blackwood family trust between Saturday night and Sunday morning. Evelyn read the number twice. Between Saturday night and Sunday morning, she said. Within hours of the wedding, Patricia confirmed, which means she knew, Evelyn said. She knew as soon as I walked in with the kids that it was over. She spent Saturday night moving the money. And if those transfers are fraudulent, She transferred it to protect it, Evelyn said. From Adrien, from the audit, from whatever the heir's provisions required her to distribute. She felt the cold moving through her now like water finding the lowest point, which means she'd already known for years that those provisions would apply someday. She wasn't protecting it from me. She'd already dealt with me 8 years ago. She was protecting it from the moment when the truth couldn't be managed anymore. Patricia set the phone down. There's something else in the message, she said. The asset transfers. A significant portion of them did not go into a Blackwood-controlled account. She paused. They went to a private entity, an LLC registered in Delaware, the managing member of that LLC, per the filing records. Evelyn felt it before she heard it. Is Gerald Harrington, Patricia said. The room was perfectly still. Margaret Blackwood and Gerald Harrington. The woman who had spent 8 years managing the concealment of Adrien's children and the man who had spent 18 months building a case against her. The two people on opposite sides of the wreckage of this weekend, moving $34 million between themselves in the 12 hours after Evelyn walked into that wedding with 3 5-year-olds in a green dress. They knew each other. They had a plan that predated this weekend. And Evelyn Carter, who had believed she was walking into that garden to reclaim her children's existence, had been the instrument that triggered it. The piece moved at exactly the right moment to create exactly the right chaos, while something else, something she had never been meant to see, moved underneath. She was not the protagonist of this story. She was the mechanism. She sat in Patricia Oduya's office on the 14th floor and felt the full weight of that understanding settle onto her, and for approximately 15 seconds, she allowed herself to feel it completely. The rage, the humiliation, the cold, specific grief of discovering that even this, even the thing she'd been most sure of, had been someone else's calculated move. And then she looked at her lawyer and said the only thing that mattered. How do I protect my children from all of them? Patricia Oduya took off her reading glasses. She set them on the desk. She looked at Evelyn Carter the way someone looks at a person they have decided to actually fight for. Let me tell you, she said, what we're going to do. Patricia Oduya talked for 47 minutes. Evelyn listened to every word. She did not interrupt. She did not ask questions until Patricia invited them. She sat in the chair across from that desk with her hands in her lap and her back straight, and her face arranged in the expression she had learned to produce when the thing she was hearing was too large to process in real time, and she needed to defer the processing until she was alone. The expression that said, I am receiving this information, I am filing it correctly, I will fall apart later in private like a functioning adult. When Patricia finished, Evelyn asked 3 questions. Patricia answered all 3. Then Evelyn said, I'll call you in the morning, and stood up and collected her children from the waiting room where Oliver had accumulated 4 paper airplanes. Mason had apparently beaten the elderly associate at 2 rounds of a card game and was unsentimental about this victory. And Lily was sitting beside the man looking at something in a picture book he'd found somewhere, their heads together in the particular companionable silence of 2 people who had decided they understood each other without needing to verify it through conversation. Lily looked up when Evelyn came in. She looked at her mother's face. She closed the book, set it on the cushion beside the associate, and stood up and took Evelyn's hand without being asked. Evelyn drove home. She made dinner, pasta with the jarred sauce she bought in bulk, because it was what Mason would eat without complaint, and she did not have the bandwidth tonight for a complaint. She got the kids through baths and the specific negotiation of bedtime that happened every night in her apartment, and that she had run so many thousands of times it had become something close to muscle memory. She turned off the lights. She sat in the kitchen. Then she called her sister. Dana picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been waiting. I saw the Tribune piece, Dana said. I know. Why didn't you tell me you were going? Because you would have talked me out of it. A pause. Yeah, I would have. Dana's voice was quiet, the particular quietness of someone who has decided to skip the argument because the event has already happened. Are you okay? Not really. What do you need? I need you to come to Chicago. Dana was silent for 3 seconds. When? Now would be good. I can get a flight tomorrow morning. Okay. Evelyn, Dana's voice shifted. What's happening that you're not telling me? Evelyn looked at the kitchen table. The remains of dinner, 3 plates, 3 cups, A paper towel Mason had folded into a shape he'd claimed was an airplane, and that had not aerodynamically performed as promised. "I'll tell you when you get here," she said. "Just come." Dana came. She arrived at O'Hare at 9:15 Tuesday morning and was at Evelyn's apartment by 10:30, carrying a rolling suitcase and the expression of someone who has read everything on the internet about a situation and has strong feelings that she is professionally containing. She was 4 years older than Evelyn, shorter, with their mother's forehead and the manner of someone who had spent 20 years as an ER nurse in Phoenix and could walk into chaos without changing her heart rate by more than 5 beats per minute. She hugged Evelyn for a long time at the door. Neither of them spoke. The kids were at school. The apartment was quiet. They sat at the kitchen table and Evelyn told her everything. The real everything, not the version she'd been giving people, not the version that started with the invitation and ended with the lab results and was the story of a woman standing up for her children. The full version. Rosa, Gerald Harrington, the LLC. Patricia's assessment of what the asset transfers meant and what all of it together suggested about the architecture of the situation Evelyn had walked into. Dana listened the way she listened to everything, completely, without the facial expressions most people used to signal that they were following along. When Evelyn finished, Dana picked up her coffee cup, drank from it, set it down. "Rosa," Dana said. "Yeah." "Rosa who covered your shifts when the kids were sick." "Yeah." "Rosa who you talked to about this for 3 years." Dana: "I'm not saying I told you so." "You are. You're just not using those words." Dana set her coffee down. "I'm saying that you have spent 5 years doing everything alone because you decided that was safer than trusting people, and the one person you let inside your guard was put there by someone who wanted access to your information. And I understand why that feels like confirmation of every decision you made to be alone. But I need you to hear me clearly when I tell you that the lesson is not to trust no one. The lesson is that you needed people you chose, not people who chose you when you were at your most isolated." Evelyn looked at the table. "I'm here," Dana said. "I'm a person you chose. So is Patricia, apparently, since she disclosed the Harrington call the minute you walked in. So talk to me about what comes next." What came next arrived in 3 parts and on 3 consecutive days, and at a pace that suggested multiple legal teams were working simultaneously and had been for longer than Evelyn was comfortable thinking about. Tuesday afternoon, Patricia called to confirm that Adrien's legal team had filed the emergency motion and that a hearing was scheduled for Thursday in a Connecticut family court. The motion sought immediate injunctive relief against the transfer of any additional Blackwood Family Trust assets pending a full audit. It also formally named Evelyn's 3 children as direct heirs to the trust, which was the legal mechanism that made the perjury exposure real and the fraud exposure structural. Patricia also confirmed that Margaret Blackwood had retained David Rourke, the same lawyer who had threatened Evelyn's nursing license in 2019. "She's going to come after you," Patricia said, "not directly. She'll come after the circumstances under which you appeared at the wedding. She'll argue that your appearance was calculated to disrupt the ceremony and interfere with the Harrington merger, which was a contractually binding arrangement, and that you therefore bear some civil liability for the resulting damages." "She's going to sue me," Evelyn said. "She's going to threaten to sue you," Patricia said. "There's a difference. The threat is designed to make you settle, to make you accept a financial arrangement in exchange for limiting what you say publicly and what you pursue legally. If we receive a formal filing, we respond, but I want you prepared for the approach." Evelyn was prepared. Wednesday brought the second part. A certified letter from Merchant Cole and Associates, Margaret's primary firm, not Rourke, which Patricia said was significant, formally notifying Evelyn that the Blackwood family disputed the circumstances under which the DNA testing had been arranged and reserved the right to challenge the chain of custody and the validity of the results. Patricia called this a delaying tactic, standard, not unexpected, the kind of move you make when you know you're losing the substance and you need to slow the procedural clock. Evelyn filed the letter in a folder she labeled with the same grim organizational precision as before. Blackwood. Current. Wednesday night was when the 3rd part arrived, and it was not a legal document. It was Adrien. He showed up at her door at 7:40 p.m., which was after the kids were in bed and before Evelyn had made any decisions about sleep. She heard the knock and looked through the peephole and stood there for a full 3 seconds before she opened it. He looked like he hadn't slept since Saturday. That was not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. It was a clinical observation. He had the specific physical appearance of a person who had been running on adrenaline and legal strategy, and the particular kind of sustained horror that comes from discovering that the person you trusted most in your life has been lying to you in ways that restructured your entire past. His eyes had the flat, overworked look of someone whose nervous system had been in emergency mode for 96 hours. He was in a dark jacket and jeans, no tie, the button at his collar open, and he was holding a manila envelope that he didn't offer her immediately. "Can I come in?" he said. Dana appeared behind Evelyn's shoulder. She looked at Adrien with the neutral professional expression of an ER nurse assessing a patient's condition. "Dana," Evelyn said, "it's okay." Dana looked at her, then at Adrien. Then she went into the kitchen and made the very particular sound of a person who was giving people privacy while retaining the right to intervene. Evelyn stepped back and let Adrien in. He stood in her living room and looked at the apartment the way people look at spaces when they're trying to understand a life from its physical evidence. The kids' drawings on the refrigerator, visible through the kitchen doorway. The stacked picture books by the couch. The single armchair that had a blanket over one arm that had been there so long it had become structural. The photographs on the wall. 3 of them. One of the kids at the lake last summer, one of Evelyn and Dana from a trip they'd taken the year before the divorce. One of the kids' first day of kindergarten with their backpacks that were almost as big as they were. He looked at that photograph for a long time. "I missed the first day of school," he said. "Yes." "I missed..." He stopped, pressed his hand briefly over his eyes, dropped it. "All of it. Everything." "Adrien," Evelyn said, not unkindly, "why are you here?" He held out the envelope. She took it. Inside was a document, not from his lawyers, handwritten on the Blackwood estate letterhead that she recognized from the stationery she'd seen years ago, in the years when she'd been in that house, and it had felt like a place she might someday belong to. The handwriting was Margaret's. She read it. It was a letter. Not a legal letter. A personal one, in Margaret's controlled, deliberate script, addressed to Evelyn by her full name. It was 2 pages. Evelyn read both of them twice, standing in the middle of her own living room, and by the time she finished the second reading, she was not sure what she was feeling, except that it was multiple things in a sequence too fast to separate. The letter was not an apology. That was the first thing she understood, and it was important to understand it clearly. Margaret Blackwood had not written 2 handwritten pages to apologize. She had written 2 pages to explain, to lay out, in precise and organized terms, the reasoning behind every decision she had made from 2017 onward. The pregnancy, the lawyers, the nursing license threat, the oath in 2020. All of it explained in the language of a woman who had made strategic choices and believed at the time that they were correct, and was now presenting the rationale not to seek forgiveness, but to establish that she had not been irrational. And then, in the last paragraph, almost as an addition, almost as an afterthought that Evelyn suspected had cost Margaret more than the rest of the letter combined, 4 sentences. "I made decisions that were not mine to make. The children are Adrien's and they are Blackwood's, and I chose to erase that rather than allow it to complicate arrangements I considered necessary. That was wrong. I am telling you this now because Adrien should hear it from me and won't, and I suspect you are the only person left who might find a use for the truth." Evelyn folded the letter. She put it back in the envelope. She set the envelope on the arm of the chair with the blanket and looked at Adrien. "She wrote you the same thing?" Evelyn said. "No," he said. "She called me this morning. She told me that she had written to you and that the letter contained an acknowledgement. She didn't read it to me." He looked at the envelope. "What does it say?" "That she was wrong," Evelyn said. "More or less." Something moved through Adrien's face. "That's the first time in my life she has ever..." He stopped. He sat down on the edge of her couch without asking, which he normally would have asked, and she let it go because he looked like a man who needed to be sitting down. "She's going to plead guilty," he said, "to the perjury. Her lawyers negotiated it this morning. She's giving back the $34 million and she's stepping down from the trust. David Rourke is withdrawing from her representation." He looked at his hands. "She's not going to fight it." Evelyn sat in the armchair. "Why not?" Because she knows what the audit will find, he said quietly. She's been diverting trust funds for 9 years, not just hiding the pregnancy. That was almost incidental to the larger structure. She's been systematically redirecting income from the trust into a set of private accounts, some of them jointly held with Gerald Harrington, who has apparently been her financial partner in this for the better part of a decade. He looked up. They've been working together, my mother and Charlotte's father, since before Charlotte and I were ever introduced. The engagement was manufactured, Evelyn said. The engagement was a mechanism, he said, to give Harrington legitimate access to the Blackwood trust accounts during a merger review. Once the merger was finalized, the combined entity would have given him oversight of both families' finances, which would have made the diversion significantly harder to detect because his people would have controlled the audit process. He paused. My mother was going to give him access to everything in exchange for ongoing financial management of her private accounts. He was going to use the merger as a laundry mechanism. Evelyn thought about the $34 million that had moved Saturday night. And when I walked in with the kids, the merger collapsed, Adrien said. The mechanism was gone. Harrington needed to move the money before the audit that everyone understood was now coming. He looked at her, and my mother helped him do it. 11 hours after you walked into that garden, she helped him move $34 million because he was her partner, and because she had apparently decided that if everything was burning down, she was going to protect the one relationship that had been financially sustaining her for a decade. Evelyn sat with this for a moment. So when Rosa was feeding Harrington information about me, he was tracking whether you were going to surface, Adrien said. He needed to know if the air situation was going to become public, and when, and in what context, because the timing of the merger depended on it never becoming public. When it became clear you were going to the wedding, he stopped. I don't know who told him, but someone did. Rosa, Evelyn said. Probably. Or someone Rosa told. He looked at her. He didn't try to stop you. He let you go, because by that point he decided that if the air situation was going to surface anyway, the wedding was actually the optimal moment. Maximum public exposure, maximum disruption to the merger before it was finalized, maximum leverage for Harrington to claim he'd been defrauded by the Blackwood family. His voice was flat. You weren't just the trigger. You were the best possible trigger at the best possible moment. You disrupted the merger before it closed, which means Harrington can claim damages from the Blackwood family rather than being liable to them. In the kitchen, Dana set down a cup with a small sound. The apartment was very quiet. Evelyn looked at Adrien. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you're trying to see all of it at once, the past and the present, and the specific quality of a person who has just learned that his mother and his almost father-in-law had been running a decade-long financial conspiracy inside his own family, and that his 3 children had been erased partly as a management strategy for that conspiracy, and that the woman he had once loved had spent 5 years being monitored as a variable in someone else's financial calculation. Are you okay? She said. He laughed. It was a short, rough sound with no happiness in it. No. Okay. Are you? No, she said. They sat in that for a moment. The Thursday hearing, he said. Patricia will be there? Yes. My team will be there. I want... He stopped, started again more carefully. I want to be clear about something. Whatever I'm doing legally, with the trust, with my mother, that's separate from the kids. I'm not pursuing any of this to create leverage over you or to create a situation where you feel like you have to negotiate with me about access. That's not... He pressed his hand over his mouth again briefly. I just want to know them. That's the only thing I actually want out of any of this. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Lily has nightmares sometimes, she said. Not often, but when she does, she doesn't call out. She just appears. She'll stand in the doorway of my room until I wake up, and then she climbs in and she doesn't say anything about it in the morning. If you make her feel safe, she'll let you see that. If you don't, she won't. And you won't know that's what you missed. She paused. Mason needs to be told why. Not a simplified why, though the real why. As close to age-appropriate as you can get. He can tell the difference, and he loses respect for people who underestimate him. Oliver will love you immediately. That's not something you earn. That's just who he is. And it means the weight of it is yours to handle responsibly. She looked at him steadily. If you're going to be there in the specific way each of them needs, not the way that's easiest for you. Adrien looked at her. His eyes were very tired and very clear at the same time. I'll figure it out, he said. I know you will, she said. That's why I'm telling you instead of refusing. He left at 9:15. Evelyn locked the door and stood in the hallway for a moment, then went to the kitchen where Dana was sitting with her second cup of coffee and the patient expression of a person who had heard everything and was deciding what to say. Don't, Evelyn said. I'm not saying anything. You're thinking something very loud. Dana drank her coffee. Thursday's going to be a long day. Yes. You should sleep. I know. But she didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table after Dana went to bed, and she went through every document in the Blackwood, current folder and then the Blackwood, legal folder from the storage unit, organizing them in the order Patricia had specified, and she did not allow herself to feel any of what the documents represented because the documents represented something that would be true tomorrow and next week, and in 20 years, regardless of when she processed it, and what she needed to do right now was be ready. She was still at the table at 1 a.m. when her phone lit up with a message from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't open it. She opened it. This is Charlotte Harrington. I know this is unexpected and you have no reason to respond. I wanted you to know that I have given a full statement to Adrien's legal team about my father's activities. I also want you to know that I was not aware of the full scope of what was happening. I understand if you don't believe that. I'm not asking you to. The children didn't do anything wrong. Neither did you. I thought you should hear that from someone on the other side of this. Evelyn read it twice. Then she set the phone down and looked at the kitchen wall for a while. She was still looking at it when Mason appeared in the doorway, in his pajamas, sleeve already at his mouth, the nightmare face on. Hey, she said softly. Come here. He crossed the kitchen and climbed into her lap. Still small enough for that. Barely. Probably not for much longer. And put his face against her shoulder and didn't say anything about what had woken him, and she didn't ask. She put her arms around him and held on. You're up late, he said into her shoulder. I am. Work stuff? Yeah, work stuff. He was quiet for a moment, then, Mom, that man at the thing we went to. His voice was muffled. Oliver said he's our dad. Evelyn closed her eyes. She held her son a little tighter. Oliver talks too much, she said carefully. Is he, though? She breathed in, breathed out, thought about Lily asking if he was going to leave again, thought about Oliver waving from the wedding chair with his whole hand, thought about Mason standing with his arms crossed, evaluating a stranger with Adrien's exact face, deciding whether the stranger was worth the risk of being evaluated back. Yes, she said. He is. Mason was quiet. He chewed his sleeve once, and she gently moved his hand away from his mouth and held it instead. They sat in the kitchen at 1 a.m. while the city moved outside the window with its ordinary nighttime sounds. Is he coming back? Mason said. Evelyn looked at the table, at the folder, at Charlotte Harrington's message still glowing on her phone screen. I think so, she said. You think or you know? I think, she said. But I'm watching. Mason considered this with the gravity of a 5-year-old who had already developed a sophisticated understanding that adults saying I think was different from adults saying I know, and that the difference mattered. Okay, he said finally. Not satisfied exactly, but accepting, in the way of a person who has decided that the information available is insufficient for a conclusion and is therefore reserving judgment. He climbed down from her lap and went back toward the hallway. He stopped at the doorway. Mom. Yeah. If he comes back, he didn't finish the sentence right away. He stood in the doorway in his pajamas with the nighttime apartment behind him and chose his words with a precision that made her chest ache. He has to actually come back. Not like, come and then leave. Actually come back. I know, she said. Because Lily won't say anything if he doesn't, Mason said. But I will. And then he went back to bed. Evelyn sat alone in the kitchen with the folders and the phone and the sound of Chicago outside. And she thought about Thursday, which was 2 days away and would involve a courtroom and lawyers and the formal, procedural beginning of the end of a decade-long deception. She thought about the $34 million and the Delaware LLC and Gerald Harrington, who was currently in federal territory that was going to cost him considerably more than a failed merger. She thought about Margaret Blackwood, who had built an empire on the management of other people's truths and was now doing the only thing left available to her, which was to stop managing and let the truth be what it was. She thought about Rosa, that one she was going to have to sit with for a long time. She closed the folders. She stacked them neatly. She put her phone face down on the table. And then, at 1:47 in the morning, the phone lit up again. And this time it was a number she recognized, Adrien's, the one he'd used to text her from Connecticut. And the message was 3 words: I found the letters. She stared at the screen. 3 dots appeared. Then the next message came through, and it was longer. And as she read it, the kitchen got very cold and very still, because what Adrien had found was not the 4 letters she had kept in a box in a storage unit in Pilsen. What he had found in his mother's personal files, in a locked drawer of the desk in Margaret's study at the Blackwood estate, opened by a locksmith at 11 o'clock that night at the direction of his legal team, were copies of the letters, all 4, with Margaret's handwritten annotations in the margins, and underneath the letters, a 5th document she had never seen and had never known existed. A letter from Evelyn herself, the one she had written by hand in the hospital 2 days after the triplets were born, addressed to Adrien, telling him he had 3 children and that she was not asking for anything except for him to know. Margaret had received it, had annotated it, had filed it, had never sent it. Evelyn held her phone in both hands and read Adrien's message 3 times and felt something happen in her chest that she could not name and was not going to try to name at 1:47 in the morning in her kitchen with her children asleep down the hall. She felt it move through her like a current, like water under ice, like something that had been frozen for 5 years finding an opening, and she sat with it for a long time in the kitchen alone until she could breathe evenly again. Then she typed back, I know, Patricia needs that document by 8 a.m. Can you get it to her tonight? 3 dots. Already sent. She set the phone down. She put her hands flat on the table. She looked at the surface of it, the scratch near the edge from when Oliver had tried to cut his own apple 2 years ago, the ring from Dana's coffee cup from earlier tonight, the small, precise, parallel marks near the corner that were inexplicably Mason's and that she had never been able to determine the origin of. Her table, her kitchen, her apartment, her life built from nothing, from $200 and 3 infant car seats, and the specific, undecorated stubbornness of a person who had decided that surviving was not sufficient, and that she was going to build something real even if she had to do it alone, in increments, in the dark. She had done it. It was real. And on Thursday morning at 9 a.m. in a Connecticut family courtroom, every person who had spent years deciding that Evelyn Carter and her children could be managed, erased, or used as an instrument in someone else's financial architecture was going to sit across a table from Patricia Oduya and discover that the woman they had miscalculated was sitting right next to her, with her folders and her copies and her 5 years of receipts, and that she had been building toward this moment not because anyone had handed it to her, but because she had gotten up every single morning and chosen to be present for her children and for herself. And that choice, compounded daily over 5 years, had turned out to be the most formidable thing in the room. She went to bed. She slept 4 hours. She woke up on Thursday morning before the alarm and lay still in the dark for exactly 60 seconds, feeling the weight of the day ahead of her. And then she got up because there was coffee to make and children to dress and a courtroom to get to, and she was not the kind of person who stayed in bed when there was somewhere she needed to be. The children were already awake when she came into the hallway. She could hear them, Oliver explaining something elaborate to Mason, Mason pushing back, Lily's voice cutting through both of them with 3 words that settled the argument, which was just Lily's particular economy of intervention. Evelyn stood in the hallway and listened to her children for 30 seconds before she went in. She pushed open the door. "Get dressed," she said. "Dana's taking you to school today. I have somewhere I need to be." Mason looked up immediately. "The work stuff?" The work stuff, she said. He held her gaze for a moment with that evaluating look that she would never stop finding both heartbreaking and extraordinary. Then he nodded once, decisively, as if he had made a private decision and was satisfied with it, and went to his dresser to find a shirt. Lily, from the other bed, had not looked up from her book, but she said very quietly, "Mom, yeah, wear the green dress." Evelyn stopped in the doorway. Lily turned a page. Evelyn went to her closet. She took out the dark green dress. She put it on. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at herself for a long moment, not at the dress, not at how she looked in it, but at the face looking back at her, which was tired and clear-eyed and somewhere past afraid, which was the right place to be for what was about to happen. She picked up her bag. She picked up her folders. She walked through her apartment, kissed each of her children in the specific way each of them required. Oliver's forehead, Mason's cheek with some resistance from Mason, Lily's temple while Lily was already turning back to her book, and said goodbye to Dana, who squeezed her hand at the door without a word. She walked down the stairs of her building and out onto the street. The morning was cool and the city was fully awake around her, already running at its particular Chicago velocity, and she walked to her car with her back straight and her bag over her shoulder and her folder in her hand. And she thought about Mason standing in the doorway at 1 a.m. saying he has to actually come back. And she thought about Lily saying, "Wear the green dress," without looking up from her book. And she thought about Oliver waving with his whole hand at a stranger who had his face. And she got in the car, and she started the engine, and she drove toward the interstate, toward Connecticut, toward a courtroom where the last 5 years of her life were about to be entered into the record. And she kept her hand steady on the wheel and her eyes on the road ahead, and she did not look in the rearview mirror even once, because everything that mattered was in front of her now, and she was done looking back. And when she walked into that courtroom in 2 hours, every person in it was going to understand that the woman they had spent 5 years trying to make smaller had used every one of those years to become exactly the size she needed to be for this moment. And that size was considerable. And she was ready. That was the word that had been cut off when she walked out of her apartment building and into the Chicago morning. And it was the right word. And she held it in her chest the entire drive to the airport and the flight to Hartford and the car to the courthouse in Stamford, where Patricia Oduya was waiting on the front steps with 2 cups of coffee, and the expression of a woman who had spent 30 years preparing for mornings like this one, and found them, if not exactly pleasurable, then at least clarifying. "How are you?" Patricia said. "Ready?" Evelyn said. Patricia handed her the coffee. "Good, because they're all in there." All of them meant Adrien's legal team, 4 people, lead counsel a man named Warren Chu, who had the compact, efficient energy of someone who had litigated large financial cases for 25 years and had no interest in anything that wasn't directly relevant to winning. It meant the Harrington family's representation, 3 lawyers from a firm that had apparently scrambled since Tuesday when Charlotte's statement had been filed and Gerald's exposure had become clear. It meant David Rourke, who was no longer representing Margaret Blackwood but was present anyway as a witness, which was its own specific kind of justice that Evelyn did not allow herself to spend too much time appreciating. It meant a representative from the Connecticut State Attorney's Office who was there to observe and who would, Patricia had explained, be filing separate criminal referrals based on whatever emerged from the civil proceedings. It meant Margaret. Evelyn had known Margaret would be there. She had prepared for it. She had rehearsed in the shower and in the car and in the half-sleep of 4-hour nights the specific act of being in the same room as Margaret Blackwood and feeling whatever she felt about that without letting it move her off the thing she was there to do. She had thought she was prepared. She walked into the courtroom and Margaret was already seated at the respondents' table with her new counsel, a woman named Sandra Elliott, who had a reputation for negotiated settlements and who Patricia said had been brought in specifically because Margaret had decided she was not going to fight this in open court. Margaret was in a dark suit and her hair was exactly as it always was, and her posture was exactly as it always was, and she did not look at Evelyn when Evelyn entered the room. That was the thing Evelyn had not prepared for. Not Margaret looking at her, Margaret not looking at her, because Margaret had always looked at her. From the first meeting in the formal sitting room to the garden in Greenwich, Margaret had always located her within seconds of entering a space, with that precise, assessing gaze that said, "I have catalogued you completely. and found you wanting. The not looking was different. The not looking was a woman who had run out of moves and knew it, and had made the very specific decision to preserve whatever remained of her composure by refusing to acknowledge the source of its dismantling. Evelyn sat beside Patricia and put her folder on the table and her coffee to her left, and her hands flat on the surface, and breathed. Adrien came in 2 minutes later. He sat on the same side as Evelyn, 2 chairs down with Warren Chu between them. He glanced at her. She glanced at him. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say yet that hadn't been covered in the documentation. The judge was a woman in her mid-50s named the Honorable Frances Almeida, who had the manner of someone who had heard enough human catastrophe across enough years to be unshockable but not indifferent. She reviewed the filings before the session began, and she did this in a silence that lasted 4 full minutes, while everyone in the room sat with the particular compressed tension of people who are waiting for a door to open. Then Judge Almeida set the papers down and looked at the room over her glasses. I've reviewed the emergency motion, the respondent's acknowledgement, the DNA results, the trust documentation, the audit findings, and the 2 corroborating statements. She paused. I'm also in receipt of a personal correspondence submitted this morning by the petitioner's counsel, which I'll address after we establish the procedural record. She looked at Sandra Elliott. Counsel, your client has indicated an intention to enter a conditional acknowledgement of the motion's core claims. Is that still the position? Sandra Elliott stood. It is, Your Honor. Mrs. Blackwood acknowledges the legitimacy of the paternity findings, the failure to disclose the existence of direct heirs to the trust during the 2020 estate review, and the improper nature of the asset transfers conducted on the evening of June 14th. She is prepared to cooperate fully with the independent audit and to return the transferred assets pending resolution of the related criminal referrals. And the personal correspondence, Judge Almeida said. Mrs. Blackwood acknowledges authoring it? She does. The judge looked at Margaret. Mrs. Blackwood, I'm going to ask you to stand. Margaret stood. She was 67 years old, and she looked it in a way she had not looked it 6 days ago in the garden, which was the only external sign of what the week had cost her. She stood straight. That was the one thing she had not lost and possibly couldn't. The posture, the held spine, the physical expression of a woman who had spent her life insisting on her own dignity, even when the content beneath it was something else entirely. You authored a letter delivered to Ms. Evelyn Carter on Monday, June 16th, Judge Almeida said. In that letter, you acknowledged making decisions that were, in your words, not yours to make. Do you affirm that acknowledgement in this proceeding? Margaret's jaw tightened. It was very small, barely visible. I do, she said. Do you acknowledge that your testimony during the 2020 Blackwood Family Trust Estate Review, in which you stated under oath that no direct heirs to the trust existed outside of your son, Adrien James Blackwood, was false? A pause of approximately 3 seconds. I do, Margaret said. Do you acknowledge that the asset transfers conducted on June 14th represent an improper attempt to remove assets from the trust estate in anticipation of a legally mandated redistribution? Another pause. Sandra Elliott touched Margaret's arm, very briefly. Margaret did not look at her. I do, she said. You may sit, the judge said. Margaret sat. And that was the moment? Not the DNA results, not the emergency motion, not even the letter. That was the moment when Evelyn understood it was over. Not because Margaret had said the words, but because of what it looked like when a person who had spent decades controlling every room she entered sat down inside a room she no longer controlled, and the sitting down was just sitting down, and the room continued regardless. The procedural portion of the hearing took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Evelyn testified once, briefly, about the circumstances of the 2019 letters and the nursing school withdrawal. She was calm. She answered precisely. When Sandra Elliott attempted a cross-examination that implied Evelyn's appearance at the wedding had been strategically timed to cause maximum damage, Patricia objected on grounds that were technical and correct, and that the judge sustained without apparent interest in the alternative narrative. Warren Chu presented the trust documents, the audit findings, the transfer records from the night of the 14th, showing $34 million moved in 3 transactions to the Delaware LLC jointly managed by Margaret Blackwood and Gerald Harrington. Charlotte's statement was entered into the record. David Rourke, when called as a witness, answered questions about the 2019 letters in the careful, selected manner of a man who had calculated precisely how much cooperation was necessary to protect himself and had offered exactly that amount, nothing more. Gerald Harrington was not in the courtroom. Gerald Harrington was, at that moment, in a separate federal proceeding in New York that had been filed Tuesday morning by the U.S. Attorney's Office and that Patricia had told Evelyn about in terms of its implications without dwelling on the specifics, because the specifics were not Evelyn's fight and not Evelyn's concern, and the only reason they existed in their current form was because Charlotte Harrington had looked across a garden at a woman she didn't know and decided that the woman was not the enemy. When the judge recessed at noon, Evelyn went into the hallway and stood against the wall and drank the remaining inch of her cold coffee and did not talk to anyone for 4 minutes. Adrien found her at the 4-minute mark. He stood beside her against the wall. Not close. A respectful distance, the distance of a person who understood that proximity required permission and had not assumed it was granted. "How are you doing?" he said. "I need about 6 months of sleep," she said. "Yeah." He looked at the hallway ceiling. "Me too." They stood there for a moment in the particular silence of two people who have been through something together without having been together in any simple sense, and the complexity of that sat in the air between them without requiring immediate resolution. "The trust will have to be restructured," he said. "The audit will probably take 6 to 8 months. The criminal proceedings will take longer." He paused. "The kids will receive what they're entitled to, their share of the direct heir provisions. I want you to know that's not contingent on anything. It's not negotiating leverage. It's just what's right." "I know," she said. "I also resigned from the Blackwood Company," he said. "Last week, while all of this was happening. I should have done it years ago." He looked at the floor. "I've been trying to figure out what I actually want to do, which turns out to be a harder question than it sounds when you've spent your whole life doing what was expected." "What do you think the answer is?" she said. "I don't know yet," he said. "Something smaller, something where I can be in Chicago." Evelyn looked at the hallway. "You're moving to Chicago?" "I'm thinking about it." "The kids would—" She stopped herself, started more carefully. "Mason would test you. He would test you in very specific ways for a considerable length of time. You should know that going in." "I know." "Oliver would probably be fine with anything you did." "I know that too." "Lily will take the longest," she said. "And when she decides, it'll be on her terms and in her time, and you won't see it coming. She'll just— one day you'll realize the door's open, but you can't push it." "I won't push it," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the floor still, and she could see the profile of his face, the angle she had once known well enough to recognize in other contexts. In Oliver's forehead when Oliver was thinking, in the particular way Mason held his jaw when he was deciding something important. 5 years had not been kind to him in certain ways and had been clarifying in others. He was not the person he'd been at 28. She was not the person she'd been at 24. What they were now was less easy and more real, and real was something she had learned to trust over comfortable. "Adrien," she said. He looked at her. "If you come to Chicago," she said carefully, "you come for them. Not for me. Not until I say otherwise. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" He held her gaze. "Yes." "Because I need time," she said. I have a lot to work through. About Rosa. About what I didn't know and should have. About what I did know and chose anyway. I can't—" She stopped. Breathed. "I can't fast forward to a thing that feels resolved when I'm still inside all of this." "I'm not asking you to," he said. "I know you're not. I'm telling you anyway." He nodded slowly. "Okay." "Okay," she said. They went back into the courtroom. The afternoon session was shorter. Judge Almeida issued the injunctive relief, froze the remaining trust assets pending the full audit, and formally entered the DNA findings into the estate record, which meant that Oliver James Carter, Mason Adrien Carter, and Lily Evelyn Carter were from this date forward recognized as direct heirs to the Blackwood family trust and entitled to the legal protections and provisions thereof. When the judge said their names, all three of them, out loud, in a Connecticut courtroom, in the formal and permanent record, Evelyn felt something happen in her body that she was not going to describe to anyone and did not need to. She felt it. She let it move through her. She put her hand flat on the table and pressed down slightly so that she had the sensation of something solid underneath her, and she breathed. Patricia put her hand briefly over Evelyn's, just for a second. Then she moved it and made a note in her legal pad. Margaret left the courtroom without looking at Evelyn. At the door, she paused. It was brief, a half-second, less. And she did not turn around, but the pause was there. And it meant something, and Evelyn would think about it later. Not today, but later. Would turn it over and try to understand what a woman like Margaret Blackwood had meant by a pause at a door after the destruction of everything she had spent 50 years building. She would not reach a conclusion that satisfied her. She had decided to be okay with that. Sandra Elliott shook Patricia's hand. Warren Chu's team began packing their files. The courtroom emptied in the incremental way of professional spaces after formal proceedings. People picking up papers, conversations starting in low voices, the slight decompression of a room that has been under sustained pressure. Evelyn sat for a moment after everyone else had stood. Just a moment. She sat in the chair with her folder in her lap, and she looked at the empty bench where Judge Almeida had been, and she thought, it's done. The specific thing she had spent 6 weeks, and in another sense 5 years, moving toward was done. And the doing of it had not felt the way she had imagined it would feel in the 4:30 in the morning versions, which were usually either vindicating or hollow. What it actually felt like was something closer to the end of carrying a very heavy thing over a very long distance. Not euphoria, not relief exactly, but the specific absence of weight, and the unfamiliar sensation of standing without it, and the slight uncertainty of what your posture is supposed to be when you're no longer braced against a load. She stood up. She was going home. The drive back to the airport and the flight to O'Hare and the drive back to Logan Square took 5 hours total, and for most of it Evelyn did not think about anything in particular. She listened to the radio, she watched the Connecticut landscape give way to the New York skyline, and then the scale of the Midwest spreading out below the plain. Flat and enormous, and deeply familiar in a way that had stopped feeling like a consolation prize sometime in the last 5 years and had started feeling like a choice she'd made and was glad of. Dana had dinner ready when she got home. Pasta again, which was both a deliberate callback and a practical decision, and the apartment smelled like garlic, and the kids were already at the table, and Oliver said, "Mom," with his whole face in the way that never got less than it was, and Mason said, "How'd it go?" with the directness of a person who had been waiting to ask all day and had managed his impatience until the door was open, and Lily looked up from her plate and looked at Evelyn's face and nodded once, slightly, as if she had asked a question internally and received an answer she found adequate. "It went okay," Evelyn said. "Just okay?" Mason said. "Better than okay," she said. "We're fine. We're going to be fine." Mason studied her for another second. Then he went back to his pasta, which was the highest vote of confidence he was capable of expressing, and which she received as such. She sat down. She ate dinner with her children and her sister at a table in a Logan Square apartment on a Thursday night in June. And it was loud, and it was ordinary. And at one point, Oliver knocked over his water glass and Mason laughed at him, and Lily quietly got up and came back with a dish towel from the counter without anyone asking her to, which was so precisely Lily that it made Evelyn's chest ache in the good direction. After dinner, after dishes, after baths, and the bedtime negotiation, and the lights out and the one reappearance by Oliver who claimed he needed another glass of water and who received it without commentary because some hills were not worth the fight, Dana sat across from Evelyn at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and the look of a person who was going to say something real. "What are you going to do about Rosa?" Dana said. Evelyn had been thinking about this since Stamford. She had been thinking about it on the plane and in the car and in the background of every other thought she'd had all day. "I don't know yet," she said. "She called me," Dana said. "Tuesday. She called my cell. She wanted me to tell you she was sorry. She called you. She didn't have the nerve to call you directly. Evelyn looked at her wine glass. She hadn't drunk from it. Did she say for how long? 2 years, Dana said. She said it started 2 years in. Harrington's people approached her. She said she told herself she was protecting you. That if Harrington had the information he needed, he'd handle the legal situation, and it would work out better for you than it would if you did it alone. She told herself a story, Evelyn said. Yes. That conveniently allowed her to do a thing that paid off for someone else while feeling like it was for me. Yes, Dana said. Evelyn sat with this. She turned the wine glass slowly on the table without lifting it. She wasn't wrong that I needed the legal situation handled, she said. She was wrong about everything else, about having the right to make that choice, about what it cost me not to know what was happening around me, about the fact that I spent 3 years telling her things I wouldn't have told her if I'd known who she was telling. Yeah, Dana said. I can understand it, Evelyn said. Understanding it isn't the same as it being okay. I know. I'm not going to go back to Kimura's, she said. Dana nodded. And I'm not going to call her, Evelyn said. Not because I'm punishing her, because there's nothing left to say that would be useful to either of us. And I'm done having conversations that aren't useful. Dana picked up her wine. What are you going to do for work? Evelyn looked at the table, at the scratch near the edge and the coffee ring and the small parallel marks from Mason that she had still not identified the source of. Patricia mentioned something, she said slowly. She does pro bono family law work on the side. She has a caseload she can't always manage. She was asking, she wasn't offering exactly, she was asking if I had any interest in training as a paralegal. Evening program, 18 months. She paused. She said the firm would cover the tuition. Dana was very still. She said I have a specific set of skills, Evelyn continued, that are relevant to the kind of work her firm does. Pattern recognition, document organization, the ability to absorb a complicated situation and identify what's actually important. She looked at her sister. She said she's worked with a lot of paralegals and she knows what she's looking at. Dana set her wine down. Evelyn. I know. I know, Evelyn said again, and her voice was rough, was genuinely rough, the way it got when something hit a place she wasn't fully defended at. Because it was nursing school in a different form, in a direction she hadn't anticipated, offered by someone who had looked at the thing Rosa and Gerald Harrington and the 2019 letter had taken from her and had seen not the absence but the underlying shape of a person who had been moving towards something specific and been redirected, and who could still get there from here. Are you going to do it? Dana said. I'm going to think about it, Evelyn said. But she already knew. The months that followed were not a transformation in the cinematic sense. There was no single scene of arrival, no morning where Evelyn woke up and the past was resolved into something clean and narrative. What there was instead was the incremental, often tedious, sometimes genuinely painful work of a life rearranging itself around a new set of facts. Adrien moved to Chicago in September. He rented an apartment in Wicker Park, 12 minutes from Evelyn's place in Logan Square, which was close enough to be present and far enough to make clear that presence was not assumption. He told the kids on a Saturday afternoon at a park on the north side, sitting on a bench with all three of them while Evelyn sat on a bench across the path, close enough to intervene and far enough to give them the space for something that was theirs. She watched Adrien's face while he talked to them. She watched Mason's arms uncross and then recross and then uncross again over the course of about 8 minutes, which was Mason's version of a significant internal negotiation. She watched Oliver immediately and completely accept the situation and begin talking about something unrelated within 3 minutes, which was Oliver's version of processing. She watched Lily sit quietly and listen to everything Adrien said, and then look across the path at Evelyn and hold the look for 3 seconds, and then look back at her father with an expression that was still private but had shifted by some small and meaningful degree. After the conversation, Mason walked over to Evelyn's bench and sat beside her. He seems okay, he said. Yeah? He made a promise, Mason said. He promised he'd come every weekend. I know. Mason looked at his shoes. I told him if he broke it, I'd remember, he said. And he said he knew that, and that was fair. He paused. He didn't try to talk me out of it. He just said, yeah, that's fair. Evelyn looked at her son. He said the same thing about Lily, Mason said. She didn't say it, but he said it anyway, like he already knew. Smart man, Evelyn said carefully. Mason considered this with appropriate skepticism. We'll see, he said, in a tone that suggested he was keeping his verdict in reserve, which was the most generous possible position he was willing to occupy, and which she understood to be significant. He kept every weekend. He drove them to school on Tuesday mornings because Tuesday mornings were the hardest logistically, and he had asked Evelyn, very specifically, not what would be nice, but what was actually hard. And she had told him. And he had shown up the following Tuesday at 7:15 with coffee for her and 3 small breakfast sandwiches from the place on Armitage that the kids liked. And he had done it the Tuesday after that and the Tuesday after that. By December, Lily had stopped watching him from a distance and started occasionally sitting beside him. She didn't say anything to Evelyn about it. She didn't need to. The nursing license threat from the 2019 letter was addressed in the civil settlement that Patricia negotiated in November. Margaret's estate, reduced significantly by the trust restructuring and the repayment obligations, paid a settlement amount that Patricia described as appropriate and that Evelyn received with the specific emotion of a person being compensated for something that was not, ultimately, compensable, but for which compensation was nonetheless the right and necessary instrument. Part of it went into an education fund for the kids. Part of it went toward the paralegal program, which Evelyn had enrolled in October, and which met 3 evenings a week in a building downtown where she sat in a classroom with 14 other adults between 23 and 58 and learned things that sometimes made her angry because of how useful they were and how long she had needed them. Margaret Blackwood entered a guilty plea in January. The perjury charge carried a potential sentence that Sandra Elliott negotiated down to supervised probation and community service given Margaret's age and her full cooperation with the financial investigation. Gerald Harrington was not as fortunate. His federal case involved wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy charges across 3 jurisdictions, and his cooperation was less complete and his circumstances less sympathetic, and the outcome reflected that. Charlotte sent Evelyn one more message in February, a short one. The federal case concluded. I wanted you to know before you read it somewhere. Evelyn had replied, Thank you. I hope you're okay. Charlotte had replied, I'm getting there. And that had been that. The complete and contained relationship between 2 women who had been placed on opposite sides of a situation neither of them had designed, who had both lost something and both survived it, and who had recognized each other clearly enough across a garden in Greenwich to extend the minimal decency of information freely given. It was enough. It didn't have to be more than that. David Rourke lost his license to practice law in Connecticut in March, which was an outcome that arrived in Evelyn's awareness as a piece of information she noted and did not celebrate, because celebration required a kind of energy she had redirected elsewhere, and because what mattered was not what happened to the people who had done damage, but what grew in the space the damage had left. What grew was slow and ordinary and specific to each person. Mason built something with Adrien on a Sunday afternoon in February, a bookshelf kit that had approximately 100 pieces and instructions that required 2 adults to interpret, and which they worked on for 4 hours with mounting frustration and occasional genuine laughter, and which stood in Mason's room afterward slightly crooked and entirely real. He had not said it was okay. He had not said he forgave anything. He had sat beside his father for 4 hours and handed him screws and argued about the instructions and built something that stood. And that was what 5 years old growing into 6 looked like in the specific currency of Mason Carter. Oliver loved Adrien with the open, uncomplicated generosity he extended to most people, and the weight of this, as Evelyn had told Adrien, was his to carry responsibly. He did. He showed up for Oliver's enthusiasm without coasting on it, without letting it substitute for the harder work of being a father to the children who required more from him. Oliver noticed this. Oliver's version of noticing was loud and articulate. Dad's good at the hard stuff, too, he said to Evelyn one evening in March, unprompted, while eating an apple, and then moved on to the next subject, without apparent awareness that he had said something that mattered. Lily allowed Adrien to read to her in April. She had brought him the book herself, without preamble, placing it in his lap while he was sitting on Evelyn's couch waiting for the boys to put on their shoes. He had not made a remark about it. He had just opened it to the first page and asked, "From the beginning?" And Lily had said, "Yes," and sat beside him, and he had read and she had listened, and when Evelyn passed the living room doorway 20 minutes later, the book was finished, and they were sitting in a silence that had the quality of two people who had arrived somewhere they both recognized. Evelyn stood in the doorway for a moment. Lily looked up. Their eyes met. Lily looked back at the book. Evelyn went back to the kitchen. On a Thursday evening in May, almost exactly a year after Evelyn had opened a cream-colored envelope between a water bill and a grocery circular, she was sitting at the kitchen table doing coursework when Adrien knocked. This was his pattern. He knocked even now, after 11 months, because she had not told him he didn't have to, and he had not assumed. She let him in. The kids were in their rooms. Dana had gone back to Phoenix in November but called every Sunday. He sat across from her at the kitchen table with the coffee she put in front of him without asking because she knew how he took it, which was the kind of knowledge you accumulate from a year of proximity and can't unknow. "How's the coursework?" he said. "Difficult," she said. "In a good way." He nodded. He looked at the table. He was doing the thing he did sometimes when he had something to say, and was deciding how to say it, which she recognized from before, and which had not changed in the fundamental way some things change and some things don't. "I've been thinking," he said. "Okay. About the fact that I'm here every Tuesday morning and every weekend, and I'm apparently, according to Mason, who told me this directly and with great specificity, apparently reliable," he said. Mason said reliable like it was a surprising outcome he hadn't fully predicted. "That sounds like Mason," she said. "It does," he said. He looked at her. "I'm not asking for anything. I want to say that first. I'm not sitting here to ask for anything or push towards something. He stopped. "I want to say out loud that I know what I had, and I know what I did with it, and I know why you built the life you built without me. And I'm not here to undo that or replace it. I'm just here, for as long as you want me here, and in whatever form that takes." He held her gaze. "That's all." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the letter she had written in a hospital 2 days after her children were born, with her hand shaking and her body exhausted and her heart doing the thing hearts do when they're extending something they're not sure will be received. She thought about that letter sitting in a locked desk drawer for 5 years, unopened and unreached. She thought about what it had cost her to write it, and what it had cost her when she understood it had never arrived. She thought about Lily's door and what she had told Adrien about it, that when Lily decided, the door would open and he wouldn't see it coming. She had been describing Lily. She was also describing herself. "I'm not there yet," she said. "I know. I might not be for a while. I know that too." She looked at the table, at the scratch, at the ring, at the small parallel marks from Mason that she had finally, last month, discovered were from a ruler he'd been using to draw straight lines in a sketchbook he kept under his bed and had been dragging across the table without realizing. She had found the sketchbook by accident when she was changing his sheets. It was full of drawings, careful, detailed drawings of buildings and bridges, and one very recognizable rendering of the Logan Square apartment seen from across the street, with 3 figures visible through the window that were clearly herself and Oliver and Lily, and a 4th figure that was Mason himself, standing outside looking up. She had put the sketchbook back under his bed. She had not told him she'd seen it. Some things you hold quietly, and they mean more for the holding. "Stay for dinner," she said to Adrien. He looked at her. "The kids will want you to," she said. "And Dana sent a recipe she says is foolproof that I've been meaning to try. It probably needs 2 people." She stood up and went to the refrigerator and opened it and stood looking at its contents with her back to him, giving him the moment and the space of it. "So, stay for dinner." She heard him exhale. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." She started pulling things out of the refrigerator and setting them on the counter. He came to stand beside her, close but not crowding, and looked at what she'd assembled. "What are we making?" he said. "I have no idea," she said. "Hand me that." He handed her what she was pointing at, and that was how it started, for the second time, and slower. Not with a declaration or a resolution or a promise made in the charged air of high stakes, but with 2 people standing at a kitchen counter on an ordinary Thursday in May, figuring out dinner, while 3 children came one by one to the kitchen doorway and stood in the light from the open room, watching, unhurried, deciding what they thought. Lily arrived last. She stood in the doorway with her bare feet on the kitchen threshold and looked at the two adults at the counter for a long moment, the way she looked at everything she was in the process of deciding about, completely, without rush, gathering what she needed. Then she walked in. She went to the drawer beside the stove and pulled out the third wooden spoon and stood between them at the counter with the spoon in her hand, waiting to be useful, already present, already there, in the particular way of a child who has made up her mind and does not need to announce it. The kitchen was warm. Outside, Chicago moved at its full and ordinary velocity. The L train on the nearby track, the sound of someone's television from 2 floors up, the particular evening smell of the city in May, green and complicated and real. Inside, someone laughed. It was Oliver, down the hall, reacting to something Mason had said, and the laughter moved through the apartment the way sound moves through a space that's been loved in, fully, without obstruction, filling the corners. Evelyn stood at the counter in her kitchen in Logan Square and felt the ordinary weight of an ordinary evening settling over her, and she was not at the end of anything, and not at the beginning exactly, but somewhere in the necessary middle, which was where all real things lived. And she was in it, and her children were in it, and outside the window the city kept moving, and the spoon in Lily's hand was ready, and she reached over and turned on the stove, and they began.